Very much so. We would like nothing better than that.
Пожалуйста, еще вопросы?
Questions?
It's a very short answer to a
complex question.
But they were only supposed to have 3 questions, as I
Аверьянов Дмитрий,
led to believe, and
студент
they're going
юридического факультета.
beyond that.
Juridical faculty, sir.
Реализация гражданами неотъемлемых, неотчуждаемых прав
The exercise by citizens of their inalienable rights
в вашей стране очень серьезные проблемы.
is posing your administration with serious problems. Such problems,
На ношение оружия,
the right to carry arms,
порнография, распространение
dissemination of pornography,
наркотиков.
narcotics, drugs.
Как вы считаете, это
What do you
проблемы,
think?
неизбежные издержки демократии,
Is this an inevitable problem
неотъемлемая часть
of
демократии,
democracy?
неизбежное зло, или
Is
с
it
этим
an inevitable
злом можно
evil?
бороться?
Or is it possible to fight against that evil?
Student from the law faculty. The realization of the unalienable...
That's a very interesting question because it was asked in a sense in a hostile way, but it's also an issue the Soviets themselves are wrestling with because as they move to glasnost and perestroika, these same issues are coming up.
And takes him up on his speech and basically says, if we achieve this point and that point that you have enumerated, do we not wind up with these problems?
For evils as they seem.
And that's one of the perennial criticisms of the United States.
Pornography or narcotics is compatible with these rights. Do you believe that these problems just are unavoidable problems connected with democracy, or they could be avoided?
Well, if I understand you correctly, this is a question about the inalienable rights of the people. Does that include the right to do criminal acts? And as for example, in the use of drugs and so forth? No. No, we have a set of laws. I think what is significant and different about our system is that every country has a constitution, and most constitutions, or practically all of the constitutions in the world, are documents in which the government tells the people what the people can do. Our Constitution is different, and the difference is in 3 words. It almost escapes everyone. The 3 words are, we the people. Our Constitution is a document in which we the people tell the government what its powers are. And it can have no powers other than those listed in that document. But very carefully, at the same time, the people give the government the power with regard to those things which they think would be destructive to society, to the family, to the individual, and so forth, infringements on their rights. And thus the government can enforce the laws. But that has all been dictated by the people.
We just want to warn our stations across the country that we're going to continue
Пожалуйста, еще вопрос.
covering this appearance of the president of Moscow State University.
Journalist.
And this may mean we will run over the hour. Just a warning to those of you from coast to coast.
People in high posts find it very difficult to cope with power. In connection with your forthcoming retirement, what feelings do you have now? And if you had the opportunity, would you serve another term as president?
Notice they're applauding that question because that's on the agenda for the party conference, which is to take place at the end of June, and there has been a new proposal that the terms be limited to 2 each of 5 years, and so it hits right at the students who are very much involved in this whole discussion. And that's, I think, the reason for the applause. And the question is, does this also affect the General Secretary? And there have been some who say yes.
Mr. Gorbachev himself, in fact, has said yes.
That's right.
Yes.
Staying for another term.
Well, I'll tell you something. It was I think it was a kind of a revenge against Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was elected 4 times, the only president. There had kind of grown a tradition in our country about 2 terms. That tradition was started by Washington, our first president, only because there was great talk at the formation of our country that we might become a monarchy, and we had just freed ourselves from a monarchy. So when the second term was over, George Washington stepped down and said he would do it stepping down so that there would not get to be the kind of idea of an inherited aristocracy. Well, succeeding presidents, many of them didn't get a chance at second term, and they did one term and were gone. But that tradition kind of remained, but it was just a tradition. And then Roosevelt ran the 4 times, died very early in his 4th term. And suddenly, in the atmosphere at that time, they added an amendment to the Constitution that presidents could only serve 2 terms. When I get out of office, I can't do this while I'm in office because it'll look if I'm selfishly doing it for myself. When I get out of office, I'm going to travel around what I call the mashed potato circuit. That is the after-dinner speaking and the speaking to luncheon groups and so forth. I'm going to travel around and try to convince the people of our country that they should wipe out that amendment to the Constitution because it was an interference with the democratic rights of the people. The people should be allowed to vote for who they wanted to vote for as many times as they want to vote for him, and that it is they who are being denied a right.
I would just say good morning, everyone. For some stations that have just joined us, we are covering President Reagan and his address at Moscow State University. It was an address that ran about a half an hour, and the president is now taking questions from students at Moscow State University.
The things that should be done. I've always described it that if in Hollywood, when I was there, if you didn't sing or dance, you wound up as an after-dinner speaker. And I didn't sing or dance. So I have a hunch that I will be out on the speaking circuit telling about a few things that I didn't get done in government, but urging the people to tell the Congress they wanted them done. Okay?
It's very interesting to see where those students applaud. They certainly are being given a sense of more participation. And again, one of the important things that Reagan said was to institutionalize these changes, and that's what they're worried about.
I'm not able to meet you in the United States. What prevented this meeting? If you don't have time to meet them here, could you do it back home?
From the biological faculty, Mr. President, I heard that a group of American Indians have come here because they
This is the civil rights issue. This is the thing, whenever we talk about civil rights in the Soviet Union, they talk about the problem in
She's being even more specific. There is a group of American Indians in Moscow now. They have tried to see Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev here, and they have been unsuccessful. This has been on Soviet television extensively.
If they've come here or whether to see them there, I'd be very happy to see them. Let me tell you just a little something about the American Indian in our land. We have provided millions of acres of land for what are called the preservations, or the reservations, I should say. They, from the beginning, announced that they wanted to maintain their way of life, as they had always lived there in the desert and the plains and so forth. And we set up these reservations so they could, and have a Bureau of Indian Affairs to help take care of them. At the same time, we provide education for them, schools on the reservations, and they are free also to leave the reservations and be American citizens among the rest of us, and many do. Some still prefer, however, that early way of life. And we've done everything we can to meet their demands as to what how they want to live. Maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we should not have humored them in that wanting to stay in that kind of primitive lifestyle. Maybe we should have said, no, come join us, be citizens, along with the rest of us. As I say, many have been very successful. And I'm very pleased to meet with them, talk with them at any time, and see what their grievances are or what they feel they might be. You'd be surprised. Some of them became very wealthy because some of those reservations were overlaying great pools of oil and you can get very rich pumping oil. And so I don't know what their complaint might be.
Пожалуйста, еще вопросы есть?
Есть. Господин президент.
themselves a meeting with the president. I'm not sure when it's going to be, but I think he's responded by saying he'll meet with them.
Все-таки себе пригласили полицая. Можете, полиция на прием. Понимаете, а если серьезно, просто хотелось бы узнать, каковы ваши впечатления?
I'd like to know what your impressions have been about the meeting, about the refuseniks, your meeting with the refuseniks.
It's funny that they laughed at that because, again, this ties in with the Indians. What the refuseniks have said, of course, is that the Indians were able to come to Moscow to protest, whereas the refuseniks are not allowed to go outside the country.
Yesterday,
This was also showed on, as you mentioned earlier, on Soviet television that there was such a meeting.
But there's been limited press about that.
Very limited.
It's been limited, and it's interesting that the entire audience seems to know about it.
And one of the things they said is that one of the people who was not a refusenik was also a fascist.
And among these just dissidents, you have invited a former collaborator with the fascists. It was a policeman serving for fascists.
There's one I don't know about, or maybe the information hasn't been all given out on that. But you have to understand that Americans come from every corner of the world. I received a letter from a man that called something to my attention recently. He said, you can go to live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany, you cannot become a German, or a Turk, or a Greek, or whatever. But he said anyone from any corner of the world can come to live in America and become an American. You have to realize that we are a people that is made up of every strain, nationality, and race of the world. And the result is that when people in our country think someone is being mistreated or treated unjustly in another country, these are people who still feel that kinship to that country because that is their heritage. In America, whenever you meet someone new and become friends, one of the first things you tell each other is what your bloodline is. For example, when I'm asked, I have to say Irish, English, and Scotch. English and Scotch on my mother's side, Irish on my father's side. But all of them have that. Well, when you take unto yourself a wife, you do not stop loving your mother. So Americans all feel a kind of a kinship to that country that their parents or their grandparents or even some great-grandparents came from. You don't lose that contact. So what I have come and what I have brought to this General Secretary, and I must say he has been very cooperative about it, I have brought lists of names that have been brought to me that are from people that are relatives or friends that know that they or believe that this individual is being mistreated here in this country, and they want him to be allowed to emigrate to our country. Some are separated families. One that I met in this the other day was born in the same time I was. He was born of Russian parents who had moved to America way back in the early 1900s. And he was born in 1911. And then sometime later, the family moved back to Russia. Now he's grown, has a son. He's an American citizen. But they wanted to go back to America. And they're being denied on the grounds that, well, they can go back to America, but his son married a Russian young lady, and they want to keep her from going back. Well, the whole family said, no, we're not going to leave her alone here. She's a member of the family now. Well, that kind of a case is brought to me personally, so I bring it to the General Secretary. And as I say, I must say, he has been most helpful and most agreeable about correcting these things. Now, I'm not blaming you, I'm blaming bureaucracy. We have the same type of thing happen in our own country, and every once in a while somebody has to get the bureaucracy by the neck and shake it loose and say, stop doing what you're doing. And this is the type of thing and the names that we have brought, and it is a list of names, all of which had been brought to me personally by either relatives or close friends and associates.
Just another advisory to our stations all on the line. The president is at Moscow State University, and we'll continue covering his dialogue
President's time is up.
with Soviet
Thank you for his
students.
answer.
He was referring there to Abe Stolars, rather, who spent much of his life living in Siberia, and by the sounds of that, Charlie is now going to have a chance to leave the country with all of his family.
Well, certainly they brought the case very much to the forefront.
What it was going to feel like to not be president anymore. I have some understanding because after I'd been governor for 8 years and then stepped down, I want to tell you what it's like. We'd only been home a few days, and someone invited us out to dinner. Nancy and I both went out, got in the back seat of the car, and waited for somebody to get in the front and drive us.
Господин президент, мы хотели бы на память о вашем посещении подарить вам
visit, we'd like to give you a souvenir
изображен университет московский.
to remind you of Moscow University.
Is there, but it's probably a little medal, which they tend to give of a picture of the university. But again, it's important for the Soviets to see that here's a president getting out voluntarily, almost with some joy. That has not happened in the Soviet Union before. You either die in office, or in one case, Khrushchev was thrown out in a rather unpleasant way.
And speaking of seeing, this is not being seen at the moment live in the Soviet Union as it is at home. But it will be, we're told, broadcast later. And undoubtedly, as this was the principal public appearance today by the president, other than a walk with Secretary Gorbachev in Red Square, will be the featured item on this story of the evening news Vremya. That question about the dissidents really comes as no surprise here, Marshal Goldman, because while most Soviets, as I understand it, would like the freedom to travel, many of the dissidents who want to leave the country are seen as traitors, particularly by Soviets who are very nationalistic.
They are. That's one of the reasons why I think the president made the statement that people come to the United States and are welcome. In the case of the Soviet Union, there's concern that we've paid for your education, we've treated you well, and now you're leaving us, and nobody is supposed to leave. Although it turns out, of course, that it's not only the Jews, it's also the Armenians. There are more leaving this year, for example, than Jews.
It was interesting. He turned the answer at the end, though. He softened it. He talked about the American bureaucracy. He said you have to grab it by the neck sometimes, and turned the question really not as such an anti-Soviet answer, but as basically an answer which addressed the problem of the bureaucracy, which during his speech, when he started talking about the bureaucracy, Marshall made the comment again that this is just one more comment that leads to perestroika, talks about the need to reform the bureaucracy in this country.
We've been watching this on the television monitor like people at home, but Sheila Kast has actually been up there on that hill overlooking Moscow. Sheila, what's it been like up there?
Well, it's fascinating, Peter. This audience has been extremely attentive to him, as you could hear from the occasional applause. They were listening very hard. He really treated them in this question and answer session to vintage Reagan. These are stories that those of us in the White House press corps who travel around with him in the country have heard a lot of times before. I think a few of his answers were not exactly responsive, and a few times he confused his listeners, but they seemed to be with him all the way. They seemed very warm.
One of the things he certainly did was to pronounce every Russian name absolutely correctly. Sheila, who were the people who were there? They looked to us like students and faculty.
Yes, there were students primarily in the front of the lecture hall. There were a lot of faculty members a little further back. They put the young people closest to. Apparently, faculty members here at the university were given a certain number of invitations that they could give to favorite students or have sort of a lottery in the department. It was spread around that way. But there were primarily students and faculty from the university.
Okay, Sheila, thanks very much. Sheila Cast up at Moscow State University. You've got a final thought about this?
Well, I just think
it's historic. There's no doubt about that.
I think it was an extraordinary happening to have somebody, a leader of a country, come and announce, I'm leaving office. The main point that he made was we've got to institutionalize this process, and that's what Gorbachev has to worry about himself.
He comes in and says he wants to dialogue, and indeed he did. And yet it was very much of a, I got the sense he felt himself, fashioned himself, imagined himself the teacher.
It was a civics lesson.
Talking to the students, civics lesson, and a bit of a preacher, proselytizing about the advantages of a system that he feels very strongly about, spent his whole life talking about.
I'm impressed, and I want to ask Marshall, if the Soviet scholar, if you get the same impression, that there are actually little parts of this speech that Mr. Gorbachev could have written himself. The context would have been entirely different. But when he talked about an independent judiciary, when he talked about rights of defendants, when he talked about freedom for the church, these are things that Mr. Gorbachev talks about openly.
It's amazing he's moving in the same direction. That may explain why the two of them really begin to hit it off together. I mean, this very unlikely couple, but you're absolutely right. Perestroika, and particularly glasnost and democratization, is to move in that direction. Balance off power, control yourself.
One fascinating reference in the speech to me that really struck me. He started talking about reforms and reforms in many nations and how things are beginning to turn around in so many nations, certainly hinting that they ought to be turning around in the Soviet Union more. And then he said, and of course there are reforms now in China that are leading so many people to begin to experience the advantages of a free market, etc. He's chiding them a little bit. The Chinese are moving faster than the Soviets.
I think the very important thing to recognize is that while Gorbachev could have made important elements of the same speech, there were digs and there were pressures here and there. Reagan is doing his best to push the process even further than I think Gorbachev would like, but there is a lot in common
But surely here we see the change Ronald Reagan to an enormous degree. Here's a man who gives the impression, at least to me, that he wants to support Gorbachev. Absolutely. He wants a restructured Soviet Union and thus is prepared to take the risk of a stronger Soviet Union.
They said to him earlier today, they were yelling out to him, what about the evil empire, Mr. President? What about this nation you used to call the evil empire? And he said that was another time, that was another era.
Well, it is really, you know, this is just, Gorbachev wants to change. Reagan clearly also wants him to change. And you almost have the sense that he wants to help him out here. After all these meetings, you know, they've developed a camaraderie, to coin a phrase, in the Soviet Union. And it's certainly a change not only for Gorbachev, but also for Reagan.
And
I'm sorry, we're going to have to, we're running out of time, as we always do. Marshall Goldman, thank you for being with us. Peter, this has been really an extraordinary speech, an extraordinary question and answer session that the President has exchanged views with students at Moscow State University. Very interesting, and we've been covering it from the beginning. We have missed a number of commercials as we have gone on during this program this morning, and we are going to pause now, give our local stations a chance to get into a station ID.
The May Day Parade. That structure is Lenin's tomb. Inside, of course, Lenin embalmed his body. For a while, Joseph Stalin was embalmed next to Lenin, but his body was removed in 1961 and buried underneath the Kremlin wall. All Soviet leaders except one are buried underneath the Kremlin wall, that one being Nikita Khrushchev. Other people buried there include Yuri Gagarin, the cosmonaut, and John Reed, the American writer and friend of the Soviet Union. Now, right over there, that structure was the first Moscow University, the first university in all of the Soviet Union, Russia then, of course. It was built in 1775, and this structure, this looming, phenomenally architected structure, is the GUM department store, really the state department store, the largest department store in the Soviet Union. On an average day, 350,000 people go through there looking for something to buy. A little bit further south on Red Square, you may recall, is where that West German pilot, Matty Roost, landed his plane last year. It was 1987. As a result of his successful invasion of Soviet airspace, really an aviation feat, Mikhail Gorbachev was able to restructure, really shake up the upper echelons of the Soviet military. For his efforts, Matty Roost got 4 years in prison. He's in Siberia right now. Now, I'd like to introduce you to a couple of people who arrived much more legitimately, a couple of American tourists. With us are Loretta Saff of Tampa and Jana DeVore of Columbia, South Carolina. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for asking us.
Now, you guys arrived just yesterday.
Just yesterday.
You're with your husbands at a math convention, self-described math groupies, I guess.
Right, right. We go where the action is.
First impressions of the Soviet Union.
A lot brighter, a lot more colorful, a lot of happy people who seem more content than what we had thought they would be. Good feelings so far.
Yeah? What about the place where you're staying? Let's talk practically.
Oh, well, unfortunately, we're not staying in what's considered a Western
hotel.
It's a lovely old hotel furnished by the Academy, the Soviet Academy, but it's Eastern. And so it's sort of not...
It would not be acceptable by American standards, I'm afraid. The bathroom is terrible.
Like, not clean, we're talking.
Not dirty. We're talking basic dirty.
Goes this way.
The people you've run into, have they been friendly? Have they been accommodating? Aggressive? What?
Yeah. The efficiency is not what we expect, what we are used to at home. When we wanted to find out whether or not we could find hotel space in Leningrad, we went to the place where we were told to go. We were told to come back in a half hour. When we went back in a half hour, we were told to come back at 6 o'clock. We still don't know if we're going to be able to go to Leningrad.
But how about the people in the streets? Have you had a chance to contact any of them?
People in the streets have been marvelous. We were watching very carefully these machines that you see where people put in coins. There's a glass sitting there and some sort of liquid comes out. It looked to us like beer because it was yellow with a head on it. And we were wondering what to do. We were thirsty, and a young soldier was there.
And he helped you out?
He helped us out. He gave us the coin, put it in.
One last question, quickly. The summit's going on. Has it had any effect on your visit at all? Do you care about it at all?
No.
No?
We can't get in anything. They've shut it all off.
All right, thanks very much. Thanks for talking to us, lady. Charlie, back to you. A couple of American tourists here in Moscow.
Very interesting. They mentioned those soda machines. Everybody shares the same glass. Seems so strange. 23 minutes after the hour, we'll be back.
You never...
Right now, we go to the news. Paul is on with me. Nice to have you here.
Nice to be here. We have quite a storm working up behind us. Hope
Yes,
we don't
you
have to take
brought the
cover.
rain.
Good morning, everyone. From all indications, this was to be a day dominated by regional issues, but once again, arms control has taken the spotlight. The president and Mikhail Gorbachev held another round of meetings, then looked on as their deputies signed 2 minor arms control agreements. Mr. Gorbachev suggested today that there still might be time to sign an agreement to limit long-range nuclear missiles. Meanwhile, Nancy Reagan is spending the day in Leningrad. On her way there, she was asked how she was enjoying her visit to the country that her husband once called the evil empire.
Well, our philosophies, our political positions are completely different, of course. But the people are very warm.
Mrs. Reagan, there's a full moon here in Moscow, and the Russians are very superstitious people. Do you think that bodes good or bad for the summit?
I wouldn't know.
That remark, of course, a reference to Mrs. Reagan's strong interest in astrology. Once in Leningrad, the First Lady laid a wreath at a memorial honoring 650,000 Soviets who died in the Nazi siege during World War II. Throughout the summit, Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, or openness, is being keenly felt. As David Ensel reports, Soviet television viewers here are getting a much broader perspective on superpower relations than they would have in the past.
Soviet television's morning show comes at the same time as Nightline, and the 2 programs combined today, a surprising mix for Soviet viewers who saw Nightline complete with the commercials. The Soviet report on the summit stressed the warmth between the 2 sides. It also showed President Reagan meeting with Jews refused permission to leave the USSR, and said meeting them showed a lack of political tact. In another part of Moscow, said the reporter, American Indians told of the human rights tragedy of their people.
For a reporter covering Moscow, it was a personal insight into just how far glasnost has changed things here, seeing my own story, no changes in translation, broadcast this morning to the whole Soviet Union. And some of the bureaucrats feel threatened by Gorbachev's solution, a 1/3 cut in the bureaucracy and fewer privileges for the elite.
From television, from newspapers, Muscovites are devouring all the information they can get on Ronald Reagan and the summit in their city.
Everybody knows that now in these days they are the center of the world, because maybe every man in the world looks towards Moscow.
So when the 2 leaders took a stroll in Red Square this morning to talk with a carefully selected group of citizens, the rest of Moscow watched from behind barricades, frustrated and envious. They weren't sure whether to blame the police or the American president.
Gorbachev met with the American people. Is Reagan afraid of us or something?
But he is meeting with their leader and with many other Russians. Moscow is proud. David Ensor, ABC News, Moscow.
And in other news this morning, Attorney General Edwin Meese says he will not quit now, but he has not ruled out resigning before the November presidential election. In an interview on CNN last night, Meese insisted he wants a chance to set the record straight after an independent counsel releases their report, which is expected to be out in the next couple of weeks. El Salvador's President Jose Napoleon Duarte reportedly has cancer and may be terminally ill. Duarte is scheduled to travel to the United States today, where sources say he will receive medical treatment here. And that is the news until the top of the hour. Spencer?
Okay, Paul, it's time once again for a look at...
And it is now 38 minutes after the hour. Nancy Reagan spent much of this morning touring the Hermitage, Leningrad's most famous museum, probably the Soviet Union's most famous museum, where art has been collected since the days of Catherine the Great. To Americans, Leningrad is usually considered the most beautiful of Russian cities. It is probably the most cultured, and Hattie Kaufman found it most spirited.
Leningrad is the most European of Soviet cities, Russia's window to the West. It was designed to be that way, purposely built to look like Venice.
The waterways still crisscrossing the city were first envisioned by Peter the Great. He named his city St. Petersburg. It was to be the showplace of the Tsarist Empire, and nowhere else in the Soviet Union is the opulence of that time more apparent. The gold and glitter in the palace of Catherine the Great are now the lure of sightseers. And tourists, Russian and foreign alike, are drawn to this place, drawn by peaceful gardens and by the undying interest in Imperial Russia. Few cities in the world have witnessed such dramatic waves of history.
This is where it all happened, where power changed hands. 1905, workers marched across this square in protest against the Tsars. The palace guards opened fire. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. It set the stage for the revolution. Years later, when Bolsheviks again marched across this square, they didn't stop at the palace gates. It was October 1917, the day Russian and world history changed.
The building survived the revolution only to face another barrage of human history. World War II. Leningrad was bombed from above and starved from within. Nazi Germany held the entire population captive within the city. The siege lasted nearly 900 days. 1.5 million people died. Most were buried in mass graves.
Very often on Piskaryovsky Cemetery, you can meet an old woman who sits near an enormous grave, more than 20,000 people buried there, and weeps. We know very well about this tragedy, about this great hunger, starvation, and resistance of those people who, in spite of that horrible circumstances, managed to survive and to preserve our city.
To have survived the siege is a feat recognized and honored every year. The survivors, veterans, walk through the streets of Leningrad. It is their day, the Soviet holiday called Victory Day.
Leningraders, we are proud not of the city, but of people who made this city. This city became one of the most beautiful cities, actually, in Europe and in the world.
And today, Leningrad remains the most beautiful city in the Soviet Union. It remains the cultural capital, home of the Kirov Ballet. And home of the Hermitage Museum, one of the greatest collections of art in the world. History has made Leningrad something Moscow simply cannot be, and everywhere that history is triumphed. Buildings restored, monuments erected. But it's not just the structures of the city, it is also the people. Here, the formality of Moscow is left behind. The message, look at me.
Fireworks always look great. It's 42 minutes after the hour. We'll be taking a look at Broadway's look at arms control negotiations right after this.
Lenin's real name was Vladimir Ulyanov. He led the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and became the chairman for the Council of People's Commissars, and since his death in 1924, he's been interred in a tomb in Red Square.
All the importance of the summit is dwarfed by another event, and that is the millennium, the 1000th anniversary of Christianity here. It'll be marked early next month. In anticipation of that celebration, the Kremlin has been extending an olive branch to leaders of the Russian Orthodox Church, which for a long time was officially banned here. Some of the thousands of churches closed since the Communist Revolution are being spruced up and reopened for the millennium, and thousands of Bibles are scheduled to be shipped in. Yet another sign that glasnost may bring a softening of traditional Soviet opposition to religion. Father Gleb Yakunin is a Russian Orthodox priest who has served 7 years in Soviet prisons for criticizing the state's treatment of his church. And good morning to you, Father. Thank you for being with us. What's the significance of President Reagan's visit to the Danilov Monastery?
Well, first of all, it's of symbolic importance because the Danilov Monastery was opened only recently. The repair is about to be over, and the very phenomenon of Danilov Monastery is the sign of a positive attitude of the state towards religion. And in these conditions, the visit to the monastery is a symbol, besides everything, it's a symbol of the fact that the American people and the president are paying attention to the religion in the Soviet Union.
Mr. Gorbachev recently admitted past mistakes in his dealings with the church. To what extent do you trust his pledges to not interfere in rights of worship in the future?
Well, to be very brief, everything depends on the party conference coming. If the line of Gorbachev wins the victory, as well as of the supporters of the reforms, then the position of the church will be good. If the conservatives take the upper hand, there won't be a better position for the church.
Also with us this morning is the official spokesman for the State's Council on Religious Affairs, Mr. Yuri Smirnov. And good morning. Thank you for being with us, sir. Does the state view the church as an appendage of the state? Let me repeat it.
Well, no, I understood you.
Okay.
Well, the church is separated from the state.
Totally separated?
Totally separated, yes.
To what extent does the church choose to, I don't want to say act as a veto power, does the state choose to act as a veto power over the state, but how much say do you have in the ways of the church? Ultimately, how much or how little control does the state want?
Well, despite the fact that the church is separated from the state, that it's still a part of our society.
It's an appendage.
Of our social structure. Well, what does it mean to us? Church means to us tens of millions of believers. Believers are Soviet citizens. Well, it's separated from the state as an institution, but it couldn't be completely separated.
Is the church free to do whatever it pleases?
Yeah, in canonic sense, yes. Well, we try.
In an economic sense?
We try not to interfere with the inner affairs of the church.
What does that mean? If the church chooses to run a charity, can the church run a charity?
Well, right now, up to the acting law, it's prohibited. Isn't that so? It's prohibited. But we think that the church could take up the charity activities, and even practically we don't wait until the new religious legislation. We do some experiments in this field, for example, well, to channelize somehow these charity activities right now. The representatives of the church are on all the boards of some funds, children funds, survival funds, culture funds, and so on. This is practically a charity activity, organized charity activity.
To your mind, Father, can the church be free, totally free, and peacefully coexist with the state?
Of course, vice versa. We are positively sure that the Church, having complete freedom, it will be always loyal to the state that has a very fair social position, and the Church will participate in all the positive processes of such a state.
And we suspect that'll exist as long as the party doesn't view it as a competitor.
Well, in other words, there are ways for cooperation between state and church.
I've got to leave it there. We'll take these messages.
Yes.
Cobblestone surprised me. Steve Fox is down in the square. Steve, that surprised you?
Yeah, I remember you mentioned that, Charlie, when we were walking around here yesterday, that it's made of cobblestone. But remember, the square is 5 centuries old, 500 years old. At the south end of this cobblestone space, St. Basil's Cathedral, St. Basil's, if you will, probably the most famous cathedral in all of Moscow. Here's an interesting fact. Built by Ivan the Terrible in the 1500s, when it was completed, he ordered the architect who was behind the construction blinded, according to legend, so he would never build another church quite as lovely. And I guess that's just one of the reasons why they called him Ivan the Terrible.
All right, Steve Fox. Thanks very much. It's 58 minutes after the hour. We'll see you later.
And tomorrow, a look at the Miss Moscow contest and All-American movie star Tom Hanks.
Final communique will be in the critical area of arms control. There has been significant progress, and we have the details tonight. And Mr. Reagan has made a speech here today which could be of great significance to millions of Soviet citizens if they could ever get to hear it. We see the limits of glasnost. We're going to begin with the substance of the President's Day. Here's our White House correspondent, Sam Donaldson.
Former White House scene stager Michael Deaver couldn't have imagined it in his wildest dreams. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev strolling around Red Square in Moscow, taking in the sights and talking to the tourists.
Господин президент Reagan.
Well, how do you do? So friendly was it all that at one point, President Reagan threw his arm around Gorbachev, just a little short of a Jimmy Carter Brezhnev bear hug. And at another point, completely took back his evil empire pronouncement.
You still think you're in an evil empire, Mr. President?
No.
Why not?
I was talking about another time and another era.
But if Gorbachev was charming the President was reaching out to the Soviet people today with his own patented brand of charm. Lunching at the Writers' Union with such artists as historian Roy Medvedev and poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko. Although during the speeches, Mr. Reagan, who hadn't slept well overnight, nodded occasionally. But the centerpiece of the President's Day, indeed of his effort to reach the Soviet public, came at Moscow University, when, in an address to the student body, Mr. Reagan made the case for democracy and freedom.
Freedom is the recognition that no single person, no single authority or government has a monopoly on the truth. Today, the world looks expectantly to signs of change, steps toward greater freedom in the Soviet Union.
The students seemed captivated by the President's speech. However, during the question period, Mr. Reagan got in trouble. First, he said, perhaps allowing American Indians to live on reservations was a mistake.
Maybe we should not have humored him in that wanting to stay in that kind of primitive lifestyle. Maybe we should have said, no, come join us, be citizens.
The President added that many Indians had gotten wealthy from pumping oil under their land. Indian groups immediately protested. Then the President suggested that the Soviets' longtime denial of exit permits for persons whose names he had brought to Gorbachev's attention had been nothing more than a bureaucratic snafu.
I'm not blaming you, I'm blaming bureaucracy. We have the same type of thing happen in our own country, and every once in a while somebody has to get the bureaucracy by the neck and shake it loose and say, stop doing what you're doing.
Compounding the President's embarrassment was a Soviet claim that in his meeting yesterday with dissidents, at which he had taken a less benign view of the problem, one of the attendees, Nikolai Rushko, was a convicted World War II collaborator.
So he was a former Nazi agent and a war criminal.
Tonight at the dinner hosted by the President, none of this was visible. Like the morning walk in Red Square, it was smiling friendship. Both the President's strengths and weaknesses were on display today as he intensified his relationship with Gorbachev, and he hopes the Soviet people. This summit's growing atmosphere of friendliness could prove to be very misleading. But there it is. Sam Donaldson, ABC News, Moscow.
It would have been extraordinary, even in these days of glasnost, if Mr. Reagan's speech had been broadcast in full to the Soviet people. In fact, what is surely the most important speech he will give here received only the barest treatment on the evening news. It may be broadcast yet. Whatever the case, the information will circulate. As we said at the beginning of the broadcast, we've begun to understand today that there has been real progress at this summit in the talks to reduce each other's strategic weapons, the ones that could hit each other's homeland. It is now early Wednesday morning here, and the talks have gone so well that the arms control teams are actually having a decent night's sleep. They have worked out those details which could be worked out here. Our national security correspondent, John McWethy, knows the details already.
It was Soviet leader Gorbachev who today suggested that a strategic arms agreement, one that would make radical cuts in each side's long-range nuclear arsenal, could be completed before Ronald Reagan leaves office.
I'm sure that if the president makes good use of the time that we have remaining, I'm sure that we will be able to prepare the treaty.
As to how the remaining barriers to such a treaty could be overcome, Gorbachev recalled an approach President Reagan once suggested: get angry.
And maybe now it is again a time to bang our fists on the table, once again.
What do you think, Mr. President? Are you going to do it?
Что вы думаете, господин президент, вы сделаете?
Do anything that works.
In fact, Secretary Shultz and Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, working quietly over the last 2 days, have made enormous progress towards a strategic arms treaty. U.S. officials tell ABC News that progress to be announced tomorrow will cover 2 of the toughest remaining questions on verification. The first is cruise missiles launched from aircraft like B-52 and B-1 bombers. Each side will designate certain air bases where all nuclear-armed cruise missiles are to be kept. There will be inspections there to prevent cheating, plus inspections at all other air bases where there are non-nuclear cruise missiles. The second area deals with mobile missiles, those on huge trucks or railroad cars. The 2 sides have agreed to restrict these missiles to certain areas where they can be counted and inspected. In 2 other key areas, there was no progress: on limiting research for weapons in space and figuring out how to keep track of a second kind of cruise missile which is launched from submarines. Some officials are saying in time the 2 sides may just agree to set aside the 2 unresolved issues, and if there is enough progress elsewhere, try to write a treaty by year's end that simply ignores them. Though it's a long shot, it would still force radical cuts in each side's nuclear arsenal. John McWethy, ABC News, Moscow.
And there were a couple of minor arms control agreements actually signed today. The Secretary of State and the Soviet Foreign Minister put their signatures on documents which said there will be joint testing of devices to measure how powerful nuclear tests actually are. And each country will notify the other in advance of any ballistic missile test. When we continue our reporting from Moscow, the cracks in the Soviet education system, struggling to interest and involve the country's youth, and the 2 most powerful men in the world strolling together in a sunny Red Square.
This is World News. Vladimir Posner asking Americans what they think of the Soviet Union on Moscow TV, unrehearsed, uncensored.
I have to think of the people who were held in the gulags in the concentration camps, right?
Even more remarkable, a Soviet correspondent returning from the U.S. after 10 years, admitting that his reports on America were distorted, concentrating only on negatives, crime, and homelessness. This is an astonishing turn for the Soviets.
Things are now being said and done in the Soviet Union that none of us in the business of studying the Soviet Union or have had any contact with the Soviet Union dreamed we would see not only in our lives, but in the lives of our children.
This new glasnost policy is an uneven process, and it's also controversial. Many powerful people oppose these freedoms. Conservatives believe that glasnost is dangerous because now Communist Party authority can be questioned, and emotional debates do erupt almost every day. A glasnost controversy. This young director was given government money to make a film. It's the true story of a manager of a farm collective who made a profit and distributed the proceeds to families. Gorbachev would approve. But in fact, Conservative Party members jailed the farm manager for breaking the old rules.
Mafia is mafia.
the judge, the prosecutor, the local party secretary.
An extraordinary attack on high-ranking anti-reform communists. Writers, lawyers, and actors meet to protest after conservatives ban the film from television.
Where did he find the courage to make this film? He found the strength to defend this man. We must not allow the banning of this film.
This bureaucrat from the Department of Agriculture received a chilly reception when he suggested the film should be changed. A member of the Gorbachev faction of the party argued the film should be aired.
If we support this film, it will help all farmers because they face many injustices in their lives.
Reform-minded communists argued that more free speech would strengthen the party.
If we can't defend our views, we ought to throw away our Communist Party membership cards.
Victory to Gorbachev. I want Gorbachev to win. And if he wins, everything will be all right.
In the end, nearly everyone present signed a letter demanding the film be aired. But there's been no final decision.
As you can imagine, President Reagan's meeting with Russian dissidents yesterday did not win rave reviews in the government-controlled press. The harshest criticism came from the newspaper Izvestia. It called the meeting with dissidents, quote, a pathetic course of self-promotion and political performance.
Throw away the gloves.
To the 3 R's in Soviet education, there's always been a 4th R, learning by rote, memorize.
About Robinson Crusoe, have you read it? Of course I have. And
Mikhail Gorbachev is trying to change that.
Get away from learning by rote, moving more towards independent creative activity by individual students.
That's not just reform, it amounts to revolution for the 47 million Soviet children in primary school. Everybody here agrees Soviet education needs some fixing. Millions of children are without textbooks because the old ones must be revised and the new ones haven't been printed yet. And just to repair the physical condition of Soviet schools will mean doubling the education budget. It's tough trying to make any change at all in this ossified and underfunded educational system, where the liberal arts have always been viewed as either irrelevant or downright counter-revolutionary. 3/4 of the high school students go on to technical and scientific schools. Still, you can see the beginnings of change if you look hard enough. At school number 199, the kids don't wear uniforms anymore. They whisper and pass notes to each other in class and act almost, well, American. And they like it.
I can speak on the topics I would like. In previous years, I had no such opportunity. I can express my opinion on different matters, and nobody could say me, shut up, you mustn't say this.
There are still some teachers which, well, think that maybe it will be better not to say something, just to be safe.
Some teachers, but others like being able to teach the truth now.
Because to tell them the truth, the thing they expect to hear from you is easier than to lie to them.
It's just possible Soviet authorities may come to rue the day they injected some perestroika into Soviet education, when this new generation of students who've suddenly been taught to think for themselves go out and start trying to act for themselves. Watch out. Richard Threlkeld, ABC News, Kiev.
And what about outside the classroom? Mr. Gorbachev knows, in fact, large numbers of people here know, that if the Soviet Union is going to be competitive, the next generation will need to be much freer than that of their parents. Freer to be themselves. Here's ABC's Don Kladstrup.
The children of perestroika, turned on, tuned in, but to what? Soviet officials are trying to make sure it's to them by allowing and even promoting such things as rock concerts.
Rock and roll is here. It's here to stay, I think. Better to accept it and make it useful, so that people would grow up naturally, not crawling somewhere in the underground.
Tolerating rock music, once considered decadent, is just one sign times have changed.
Inside, we were all lonely, but we didn't want to live just for material things.
When Soviet cinemas ran this film, Is It Easy to Be Young?, it was an extraordinary admission by authorities that among this generation, there are some very troubled youngsters.
It was so sensational because this was a revelation to millions of people who never knew that such things like youth alienation is existing.
And how could they know, after decades of propaganda, extolling the virtues of a perfect communist youth, dedicated and devoted to building a perfect communist society? The picture today is a little different.
We're punks. We're rubbish, tattered and bedraggled. But we're your children, and you made us this way.
Party leader Mikhail Gorbachev is clearly worried. We have bored our young people with preaching, he told Komsomol, the Communist Youth League responsible for molding Soviet youth. But membership is down, the organization seen as stuffy and old-fashioned. Conform, obey. That was the message. Today, young people are told, be independent, think freely. Confusing times for many, like 22-year-old Vladimir Tanayev, an engineering student from Moscow.
I don't like to think for another people, and I don't like when another people think for me.
Vladimir is like many his age who are inclined to do what they want, not what the state wants. He believes the soul of the country is to be found in the church, not in the Communist Party.
God gives us a soul, gives us a heart, and it gives us forces to live and to make something beautiful.
And what will Mr. Gorbachev give with his vision of perestroika, and how soon?
It takes a long time. I think it takes about 10 or 20 years. And I don't know what will happen if the Gorbachev will die. What will be after that? Maybe the next Stalin.
Don Kladstrup, ABC News, Moscow.
Barry Serafin will have today's other news in just a minute. And later in the broadcast, we will follow the President and the General Secretary as they turn Red Square into a stage.
To the 650,000 Russians who died here in the Nazi siege in World War II. Although Mrs. Reagan's motorcade route had not been released, thousands lined the streets as she traveled to the Hermitage, one of the world's great museums. The art collection was begun in 1764 by Catherine the Great. This art, generally regarded as one of the finest collections in the world, is housed in 400 rooms. It numbers more than 65,000 pieces. Much of it still is kept from public view, but Mrs. Reagan saw enough to describe it as overwhelming. Later, she traveled by hydrofoil to Peter the Great's summer palace and visited the ornate reception rooms. And like any good tourist, Mrs. Reagan made a wish at this fountain, but she would not reveal what it was. The Reagans won't have time to try one of Moscow's newest enterprises, private restaurants. There aren't many, and they're not going to win any stars from serious food critics, but this is a new experience for the Soviets, and they are trying. One family was so pleased with the table of 6 Americans, they sang and danced and knocked some rubles off the check.
Their public demands a message. Movies should expose the moral and political shortcomings of society. Right now, those movie makers feel they have the responsibility and the power to change the world.
Freedom, real freedom. Not freedom for propaganda, but real freedom. Now we have no closed themes, in our life. Everything is open. Everything.
He is Nikolai Gubenko, director of Moscow's famous avant-garde theater, the Taganka. He is also a filmmaker. Gubenko's new movie is about a village wiped out by a hurricane. It's the story of a Communist Party official named Vera who is sent to help and finds herself caught between a bureaucracy that doesn't care and people who expect the government to rebuild their houses and don't want to do anything for themselves. Something Nikolai Gubenko said to us summed up the astonishing hopefulness Mikhail Gorbachev has breathed into the heart and soul of this country.
I'm ready. I'm ready to everything. Because I understand that maybe this is the only, Gorbachev is the only chance for us to save our Russia.
And that's tonight's CBS Evening News. Dan Rather with Charles Carroll. See you tomorrow from inside the Kremlin. Good night.
What we've decided to do is talk to each other instead of about each other.
This is a group of people from Moscow and from one of the towns near Moscow. So let us welcome the President of the United States.
Thank you very much. Like a Western politician, the General Secretary of the Communist Party began introducing Mr. Reagan to some constituents, tourists from Moscow and the provinces visiting Red Square. He even brought a baby into the act.
Do you recognize President Reagan? He asked.
А ну пожми руку, поздоровайся. Ну.
The optimistic tone was echoed by the two foreign ministers as they signed a series of small treaties. Most importantly, an agreement to notify each other at least 24 hours before ballistic missile test launches. Comparing a strategic arms treaty to a harvest, they raised hopes of another summit.
What we see here, as Minister Shevardnadze quite well expressed it, is a sort of harvest.
Generally speaking, it's in the fall that we collect the harvest.
American reporters present said Mr. Reagan looked tired and asked White House spokesman Marlin Fitzwater about his health.
Almost every reporter who has come back from a pool has commented on the president looking tired or listless, or one pool report today saying that he had dozed off briefly. Is there a problem with the president's health or stamina? Is he having any problems?
There's no problem with the president's health. He did have a difficult night's sleep, and we're all a little tired, and I suspect that was reflected probably in our entire delegation.
The President's Day concluded with toasts at a dinner hosted by the Reagans. Tomorrow, the degree of progress reached in the summit meetings will be described in a communique.
There were reports today of major public demonstrations in Soviet Armenia. The Associated Press and Reuters said thousands of demonstrators were out in the streets of the Armenian capital of Yerevan. They are demanding the return of a disputed region to Armenian control, something the Soviet leadership has thus far refused. Back in this country, the U.S. got in under the wire this morning with a test of a Pershing II missile motor. The firing of the motor near Pueblo, Colorado was called a success. Today was the last day allowed under the new Intermediate Range Missile Treaty for such testing. In other domestic U.S. news today, the Supreme Court have had most of their Moscow summit chats in private. But today they also started talking to each other in public. Here's an excerpt of their exchanges, first on a couch inside the Kremlin, then outside in Red Square.
Mr. President, do you think you could make any progress on arms control without agreeing to further your understanding on SDI, where you left it last December?
No, we're settled on SDI.
You're settled, sir? Have you got something new?
No, I mean, that's never been a part of the negotiating.
Well, Mr. General Secretary, are you settled on SDI?
У нас был вчера большой разговор
по вопросам стратегических наступательных вооружений, по всему комплексу вооружений, химическим и обычным особенно.
We had a very substantial discussion yesterday on arms control questions, including also chemical weapons and particularly conventional arms.
Мы пришли к этой беседе уже с определенным прогрессом, и я думаю, после этой беседы будет прогресс еще.
There had been some progress even before that talk yesterday, and I'm sure that there will be more progress.
Я уверен, что если господин президент распорядится эффективно оставшимся временем у него, то мы еще сможем этот договор подготовить.
And I'm sure that if the president makes good use of the time that we have remaining, I'm sure that we will be able to prepare the treaty.
You think so, Mr. President?
Yes, I'm very pleased to hear what they're saying.
Да, я очень рад, что господин Горбачев это сказал.
So is a treaty possible?
Вы считаете, что договор возможен? Договор по СНВ.
Если вы меня спрашиваете, то я считаю, что он возможен.
If that question is to me, yes, I think that the treaty is possible.
Знаете, иногда у нас с президентом были такие ситуации, когда вроде мы оказывались в тупике.
You know, the president and I sometimes did have situations when we seemed to be in an impasse.
И я помню случай в Женеве, когда президент говорит, в конце концов, давайте ударим кулаками по столу.
And I remember during one of our discussions in Geneva, the president said, well, let's stamp our fists on the table.
Я сказал, давайте.
I said, all right.
К утру мы все согласовали.
And by morning, everything was agreed.
И успешно завершили Женеву. Это так было.
The Geneva negotiations were successfully completed.
Может быть, сейчас подходит время, когда надо ударить кулаком по столу еще раз.
And maybe now it is again a time to bang our fists on the table once again.
What do you think, Mr. President? Are you going to do it?
Что вы думаете, господин президент, вы делаете?
Do anything that works.
Если это поможет, да.
Вот так.
So that's the way it is.
On that note, the two leaders went for a walk in Red Square and talked with some Soviet citizens.
Вот мы встретимся с президентом, начинаем говорить с ним.
When
Он
we meet
начинает
with the president
задавать
and
вопросы
begin
и
to
кое-что
talk,
подвергать
he begins to ask
критике в
questions.
нашей
He
стране.
sometimes
Я
criticizes
тоже
things
делаю
about our
самое
country.
по
I
отношению
do
к
the same
Америке.
thing about America.
И я заметил, и я предложил президенту, что многое, может быть, и происходит от того, что мы мало знаем о наших странах. Мы договорились,
This is the
давайте
result of
разбираться,
misconceptions about each other. So let's try to sort things out. Let's exchange our views. And I said to the president that I cannot agree with some of his criticisms.
Мы свою страну, так сказать,
We
знаем,
know
все
our
ее
country.
достижения и
We
проблемы.
know both the
Если бы не было
achievements and the
проблем,
problems of our country. If we
Но
didn't
мы
have
гордимся
problems, we would
своей
not
страной,
launch
это
the
наша
perestroika.
страна. И
I
при том у нас
think
критика теперь президента, она
we are now in our own country so
слишком
self-critical
вялая,
that even the president's criticisms
знаем и свои
sound
достижения,
rather
и
weak
проблемы.
because we know our own problems,
Я
our
высказал
own
президенту,
achievements
что
and
в Америке лично у
deficiencies.
президента не хватает самокритики.
And I said to the president that sometimes America is not self-critical enough.
Ну, я ничего не придумал, так?
But that's not my invention. I think that's indeed so.
Before things get too far out of hand,
Но пока не слишком уж далеко мы зайдем.
we find ourselves standing like this.
Мы лучше вот так вот стоим.
Хорошо.
I have a dream that if all the young people of the world could get to know each other, there'd never be another war.
Мечта. Мне кажется, что если все молодые во всем мире познакомились друг с другом, то никогда не было бы войны.
This is the dream of all of us.
У них есть суждения, они в поездках бывают, что вот надо, чтобы то, что между народами и простыми людьми происходит, надо, чтобы и у политиков это понимание.
People say on my numerous trips in the Soviet Union, I've heard many people
Она
say
добавляет даже в
that
первую
this
очередь.
friendship between the peoples should be reflected in friendships among the politicians too, in
А,
policies.
добавление.
And she says, above all, there should be cooperation in policies.
До свидания.
До свидания. And should the arms reduction gradually, and we welcome very much the fact, we thank you, Mr. President, for doing this, for pursuing arms reductions. I think you certainly would support the idea of scrapping your weapons.
Yes, we want to do that. And every time us politicians get out of line and seem to be arguing, you stomp your feet and tell us to straighten up.
И действительно мы хотим это сделать. И каждый раз, что мы политики выходим из-под контроля и друг с другом спорим слишком, вы топните ногой и говорят, что приведите себя в порядок. Хорошо. До свидания. Приятного путешествия.
One member of the Politburo, and these are the top guys in the government, when one guy decides to take a trip, all the other members of the Politburo go to see him off. Do they think he can't find the train? They wave goodbye to him.
Yes, goodbye.
Now, this letter appears in the newspaper and says, what's going on here? Why do they all stick around with their guy?
What is going on? It's a serious people. They have to solve 1,000 problems, make many decisions. Why they waste their time? Oh.
Now, this amazed you?
Yes.
Could you have made fun of the Politburo 2-3 years ago?
A few months ago, it would be impossible. It's a question of weeks and not the question of years. So it really means that something interesting is going on in this country.
Here's a perfect example. This letter appeared on March the 13th this year in the newspaper Sovietskaya Rossiya. It filled the whole page.
The whole page?
Had that ever happened before?
Never.
The letter was a full-scale attack on Gorbachev's program. It criticized Glasnost, it admired Stalin. It was signed by a teacher, Nina Andreeva.
But everybody in the Soviet Union is absolutely certain that this letter was made by somebody who is against Gorbachev.
Somebody like Yegor Ligachev over there on the right. Number 2 in the Kremlin, he quietly told senior Soviet editors he liked the letter. It was reprinted, distributed. Meanwhile, where were Gorbachev's supporters? For the next 3 weeks after that letter appeared, what happened?
Nothing.
No letters in support of Gorbachev?
No letters.
No letters in support of Perestroika?
No one article in which this letter was criticized. Total silence.
For 3 weeks?
For 2 weeks.
But finally, on April the 5th, an editorial appeared on the front page of Pravda, boldly proclaiming allegiance to the Gorbachev plan and calling the Andreeva letter wrong.
And it's strange that Gorbachev needed so long time in order to rebut this challenge to his authority and his policy.
Is it a fair assessment to say that for 3 weeks, Gorbachev was politicking with the other members of the Politburo, saying, I want to publish an answer, join me. I want to publish an answer, join me. It took 3 weeks to get allies?
I am not sure that exactly this happened.
That doesn't sound like this is a man in total control of his government.
He has never been total control.
So where were Gorbachev's supporters? Well, they were scared. They weren't sure how strong their boss was. They weren't sure he was going to protect them. Once it was safe, however, well, then the letters poured in supporting Gorbachev. Now, here is a fascinating footnote to all this. Where was Gorbachev on the day the anti-Gorbachev letter appeared? He was out of the country in Yugoslavia. His top colleague, Yakovlev, was in Mongolia. Now, where was Ligachev the day he got his in Pravda? He, too, was out of town in northern Russia. These skirmishes are so sensitive. They wait till you're out of town before they get you.
So that letter to the editor about everyone going to the train station and why so many people are waving, so they all want to go see to make sure that the leader gets on the train?
Right, make sure they leave, right. And you can follow it all in the letters to the editor column.
Robert Kowitz, thank you. In Cyrillic, if you can read Cyrillic. 16 before the hour. Coming up later on CBS this morning, American Jazz in Moscow, Dave Brubeck is going to be joining us.
And also coming up, Sylvester Stallone in Rambo 3.
From Moscow, here is Dan Rather.
And good morning to you. President Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev concluded 4 days of summit talks today with smiles and handshakes. In just a moment, we expect President Reagan to speak to a news conference at Spaso House. That's the residence of the U.S. ambassador here in Moscow. Earlier today, the two leaders celebrated a success from the last summit, exchanging the ratified documents of the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty. This is the one upon which they reached agreement last December in Washington. Both said they were making progress toward a much bigger agreement on strategic weapons. Gorbachev said, and I quote him now, "It must be accomplished." Gorbachev later held a news conference, so far as we can determine, the first he has ever held in his home country. One question was about Boris Yeltsin, the demoted former Gorbachev ally and right-hand man on the Politburo, who in an interview with CBS News this week indicated that it might be necessary to oust the Kremlin's current #2 man, the reputed opponent of perestroika, Igor Ligachev. Gorbachev said he hasn't seen the interview, but he didn't sound pleased.
And so Comrade Yeltsin seems to be in disagreement with the decision taken by the Central Committee of the party. Well then, if that is so, we must ask him in the Central Committee, and we shall demand that he explain his position and what he's out for. It means that his opinion is at variance with the opinion of the Central Committee of the party.
Что касается товарища Лигачева и его отставки, такой проблемы в Центральном комитете партии, Политбюро не существует.
That problem simply is non-existent, and that's all.
In the news conference, Gorbachev also complained about what he called contradictions in U.S. policy, especially on what he sees as discrimination in trade. But President Reagan has arrived at Spaso House for the news conference, so let's go live to Spaso House. The president, who's nodded off from time to time, certainly looks sprightly this morning.
Just this one time, I might speak for all of you as well as myself. I would like to extend my thanks to General Secretary Gorbachev, all of his associates in the Soviet government, and the people of Moscow for all they've done to make our stay here a pleasant one, and this summit conference the success it has been. This is my 4th summit. For some in our governments and some of you in the media, the number's higher, but a good deal of important work has been accomplished here in Moscow. The personal relationship between Mr. Gorbachev and me, the various members of our respective delegations, has continued to deepen and improve. But personal relationships and hopes for peace are not by themselves enough. I think history will note that in our approach to the summit process, the United States has sought a consistency of expression as well as purpose. While at every turn I've tried to state our overwhelming desire for peace, I have also tried to note the existence of fundamental differences. And that's why it's a source of great satisfaction that those differences, in part as a result of these meetings, continue to recede. In addition, spokesmen for the Soviet government have noted the change of policy, indeed the profound change of policy that has occurred in their own government. The United States is fully cognizant of this change and aware of its implications. In noting the differences that still stand between us, therefore, my desire has not been to sound a note of discouragement, but one of realism. Not to conduct a tutorial, but to give the kind of emphatic testimony to the truth that over the long run removes illusion and moves the process of negotiation forward. From our standpoint, this approach has borne fruit at previous meetings and again at this summit conference. And here, permit me to go back for just a moment to our first summit meeting at Geneva. There we agreed on certain fundamental realities that would govern our relations, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, that the United States and the Soviet Union bear special responsibilities for avoiding the risk of war, that neither side should seek military superiority over the other. We affirmed our determination to prevent war, whether nuclear or conventional, and our resolve to contribute in every way possible, along with other nations, to a safer world. We also set out a broad agenda and initiated a new process of dialogue to address the sources of tension in U.S.-Soviet relations. Since Geneva, we have achieved, through a sustained effort, progress across this broad agenda. Our first discussions here in Moscow focused on the important matter of human rights, individual freedoms. The United States views human rights as fundamental to our relationship with the Soviet Union and all nations. From the beginning, we've stressed this point and are encouraged by recent signs of progress in the Soviet Union. I believe that where people have the right to speak, write, travel, and worship freely, creative energies are released. On several occasions, I've said that nations do not distrust each other because they're armed. They are armed because they distrust each other. For the past 3 years, General Secretary Gorbachev and I have worked to build a relationship of greater trust. And we both recognize that one way to do that is to improve understanding between our two countries through broader people-to-people contacts. A series of agreements to expand U.S.-Soviet bilateral cooperation, including cultural exchanges, have been concluded. We agreed to expand our student exchange programs with the goal of allowing hundreds and eventually thousands of Soviet and American high school students to study in each other's classrooms. For our future relations, academic, cultural, and other exchanges are of greater importance. Turning to regional issues, Mr. Gorbachev and I agree that there must be peaceful solutions to these conflicts. Our goal is to advance independence, security, and freedom. The Soviet decision to withdraw from Afghanistan is significant, and we agree that building on the Afghan settlement leads to an approach to other regional problems. Our discussions also dealt with Cambodia, Angola, Ethiopia, the Middle East, and the Persian Gulf and Central America. Each of our summit meetings moved us farther toward an INF treaty, capped by today's exchange of ratification instruments, which now makes it a reality. Each meeting has also moved us farther toward meeting the even greater challenge of crafting a treaty to reduce our strategic nuclear arsenals. In Geneva, the General Secretary and I agreed on the concept of 50% reductions, and in Reykjavik on numerical limits for warheads and delivery vehicles, in Washington on intensive work to complete a START treaty, including comprehensive verification provisions building upon those in INF. Here in Moscow, we've made important additional strides toward that objective. Verification is one of the most important and most difficult issues for us, and I'm pleased to report progress in this area too. We've moved forward in other areas as well, including agreements on an experiment to improve the verification of existing nuclear testing treaties and on notification of strategic ballistic missile launches. Finally, let me say how deeply moving I have found my discussions with various citizens of the Soviet Union. The monks of Danilov, the dissidents and refuseniks, the writers and artists, the students and young people have shown once again that spiritual values are cherished in this nation. It's my fervent hope that those values will attain even fuller expression. And now I will be happy to take your questions, and Helen, we begin with you.
President, I know you've touched on this, but at your first news conference in 1981, you said that the Soviets lie and cheat and to pursue their ends of world domination. What has really changed your mind? Can the American people really trust the Russians now? And I'd like to follow up.
Well, Helen, that was the first press conference that I had held since being elected president. And the question that came to me was, could we believe the Russians, or would they lie to us? And my answer at that time was not expressing my opinion. I said, I will answer that with their own words. And then I cited some of the leaders of the communist movement in the Soviet Union that said that the only immorality was anything that slowed the growth of socialism, and that there was no immorality in lying or cheating or doing anything of that kind as long as it advanced the cause of socialism. Now, that was my answer. So it wasn't an opinion. I was quoting what their leaders themselves, the beginners of that particular system, had said.
You still think that, and can you now declare the Cold War over?
I think right now, of course, as I've said, doviai no proviai, trust but verify.
Well, is that the atmosphere?
But I think that there is quite a difference today in the leadership and in the relationship between our two countries. And we have held very productive meetings that I think were productive for both sides.
Mr. President, on the START treaty, what are the areas of progress, or what's the specific progress that you achieved here? And why do you think that you can achieve, you can conclude the treaty this year when Senate leaders are urging you to go slow, and this summit, with all its momentum, wasn't able to break the impasse?
Well, the Senate leaders themselves brought the ratification papers here that we just received today on the INF treaty. It meant changing their own schedules a great deal and speeding up the ratification process. I think that we could count on them to feel the same if we are coming to final agreement on a START treaty. But I want to remind you of one thing that we've said over and over again. The START treaty is infinitely more complex than the INF treaty. And therefore, there's going to be continued negotiation on a number of points. And then it will depend on the Senate. If we have agreed upon a treaty, it is their responsibility to thoroughly study that treaty and then issue ratification of it if they find it satisfactory. We can hope, I would hope, that before the year is out, that we could eliminate the differences that still exist. But if not, I would hope that my successor would continue, because here we are getting at, I think, the most important reduction that should take place in nuclear weapons. The most destabilizing are the intercontinental ballistic missiles in which someone pushes a button and minutes later a part of the earth blows up. And that's why, and the thing that I express my hope about is that not only have we said 50%, but in that first meeting in Geneva, the General Secretary proposed the idea also of reducing by half our nuclear missiles.
Follow up, sir. Could you go over the areas of progress on START that you achieved here?
No, I don't think that I should go on. The conversations are still going on, and there are things still being discussed. And as I say, progress has been made, or we wouldn't still be talking the way we are. But there's a young lady in the back that I think is native to the scene.
Mr. President, is there something in Soviet-American relations that you would advise your successor to leave behind? And is there something that you would specially advise to take to the future?
Wait a minute, if I heard the entire question, special advice on what?
Something in Soviet-American relations that you would advise your successor to leave behind. And is there something specific that you would advise him to take to the future? To follow up. To follow up, yeah.
Yes. If these negotiations and so forth are still going on, I will do everything I can to persuade my successor to follow up and to continue. And as a matter of fact, I think I'll tell him that he will find the Russian people most warm and hospitable and friendly. Andrea?
Soviet officials have told us that they have dossiers on all of the dissidents with whom you met, and that some of those people, in fact, they've said that all those people are not the best people representing Soviet society. How do you feel about the fact that they have kept dossiers on these dissidents with whom you met? And doesn't that contradict your view that there have been improvements here and that this is a more open society under Mr. Gorbachev?
Well, no, the figures themselves reveal that improvements have been made. Some 300 people have been freed from imprisonment. A number of people. The lists that we bring are names that have been brought to our attention by relatives or friends, their own relatives, for example, living in our country now. And I have brought those names to the General Secretary and explained the personal interest that we have in them. And a great many of them have since been allowed to come to our country or to other countries that they preferred, such as Israel. And so I think there has been a sizable improvement. And we still are going to continue doing that.
Sir, what about the fact that the very people with whom you met have now been investigated by Soviet authorities and might be subject to some form of retaliation? I mean, Mr. Gorbachev said today that you no longer feel that this is the evil empire, that you told him that within the Kremlin walls. Doesn't this contradict your new feeling of optimism about the Soviet Union?
No, because as I say, he has received the latest list that I brought here, and previous experiences with this, a great many of those people have been allowed to come to our country. And, well, Sam?
Sir, yesterday you did say you no longer believe the Soviet Union is an evil empire. You said that was another time, another era. What's changed? Is it just Mr. Gorbachev's succession to the General Secretaryship, or have you yourself changed or expanded your view of the Soviet Union?
No, I think that a great deal of it is due to the General Secretary, who I have found different than previous Soviet leaders have been, but that also, as we have pursued this, we have found them willing to enter into negotiations with us. And I think that enough progress has been made that we can look with optimism on future negotiations.
Sir, I suppose I'm asking if you think that there's anything that you have learned, that you personally have expanded or changed your views because you've had an opportunity to learn more about this country over the years and about their system, so that you think you are part of the process, or is it just Gorbachev?
Well, a large part of it is Mr. Gorbachev as a leader, and I think there have been changes here as they have sought to make, well, I read Perestroika, and I found much in it that I could agree with. Bill?
Mr. President, Mr. Gorbachev said in his news conference that he thought you could have achieved more in this summit. And specifically, he went on to say that on the issue of the ABM interpretation and treaty, he said that you had gone back on your word, that in Geneva you had agreed that you would no longer seek military superiority, and that by holding to SDI, the development of SDI, you were seeking superiority in outer space, and that therefore you had gone back on your word. Are you seeking superiority in outer space? Can you reach a START agreement without some accommodation on SDI and the ABM question?
SDI, in my mind, maybe some of my people wouldn't agree with me, but the whole thing was my idea, to see if there could not be developed a defensive weapon that would make it virtually impossible for nuclear missiles to get through to their targets in another country. And from the very beginning, I have said that if and when such a system can be developed, I would support the idea of making it available worldwide, because since we all know how to make nuclear missiles, sometime there could be a madman come along, as a Hitler came along, who could then make those missiles, but that my idea would be the sharing of the knowledge of SDI as a defensive weapon would be accompanied by the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And I happen to believe that this will be a lot better world if we get rid of all the nuclear weapons. And that is what my dream of SDI is, that it can be the tool by which we eliminate those weapons.
Follow up. Mr. Gorbachev said today that he did not believe that it's for defensive purposes.
I know he has said that before, and
You failed to convince him, despite the fact that you're on such good terms with him.
Well, maybe he just doesn't know me well enough. But from the very first, I have said that that is my goal, for that defensive weapon. There is nothing offensive about it. It cannot hurt or kill anyone. It can just make it impossible for missiles to get through the screen. Now, you, and then I'm going to start spreading around here.
Mr. President, I want to ask you about this effort that you again stated today to try to get a START treaty before you leave office. You have less than 8 months left in office. Mikhail Gorbachev could have 20 years. By setting up any kind of deadline, no matter how unofficial, aren't you putting all the pressure on the U.S. side?
Oh, no, no, we set no deadline. I said that we're going to continue working toward that. And I could hope that maybe in that period of time. But no, I am dead set against deadlines. You don't make a treaty just to simply have it be achieved at a certain point in time. The treaty is ready when it is a good treaty and good for all sides involved. And that's what we'll do instead of setting a deadline and then saying, well, let's sign it because we've reached the deadline. It has to be good.
Let me, if I might follow up, sir. There is also talk about a 5th summit sometime this year to sign a treaty, which might come sometime in the fall, to prevent U.S.-Soviet relations from being mixed up in politics. Are you willing to rule out a summit until the presidential campaign is over in November?
I'd make any decision of that kind based on how I thought it could affect the situation. And if it gave a promise of success, then go for it. You, no, the young lady, and then I'll take you.
Mr. President, you were asked by one of the students at Moscow University yesterday about the practice in the United States of limiting presidential terms. And I believe you said you were going to go out in the mashed potato circuit next year and campaign for repeal of that constitutional amendment. Were you aware that Mr. Gorbachev, as part of his reforms, is promoting the idea of limited terms for the leader of the Soviet Union? And do you think it's a good idea for the Soviet Union?
Well, I would hesitate to comment on that. I mean, this system of government here, you do not have a national election in which all of the people vote to see who would be the leader. My objection to the constitutional amendment that was passed in our country, limiting a president to 2 terms, was the fact that that is the only office in the United States in which all the people vote for the candidates for that office. And it seems to me that it is an infringement on the rights of our people in a democracy to tell them that they can't vote for someone because of a time limit. I think it impinges on their right to vote for whoever they want to vote for as many times as they want to vote for them. That is the principle of democracy.
Let me just ask one more question from the students. You talked a lot about how it is a positive thing for students from both countries to mix and mingle, to get to know each other, to understand each other. Do you think part of your positive feeling about the Soviet Union these days comes as a result of greater tolerance that you've developed as a result of your meetings with Mr. Gorbachev over the past few years?
Well, I have found that Mr. Gorbachev and I think, have a very satisfactory relationship. But at the same time, I am never going to relax my belief in the need for verification of agreements that we might make, and I'm quite sure he feels the same way. Now, where's the gentleman?
President, I understand that in your first meeting with Mr. Gorbachev, he suggested the reduction of 500,000 military personnel at certain conditions, but there was no follow-up, as it were. Was this subject raised again, and what was your response?
No, this proposal, this has just been a suggestion made of the removal of 500,000 men on the NATO line in the European front. This has to be considered. We think that we are coming to a point, and that he himself is willing to, of reductions in conventional weapons along that front and conventional forces as well as the nuclear forces. But the simple removing of 500,000 men would not be exactly equal, because his military would be moved a short distance back away from the front. Well, there's a 3,000-mile ocean between where our men would have to be moved. And in the event of an emergency, we'd have an ocean to cross to get our men back there and equal, so that has to be considered. And lady?
Mr. Gorbachev, in his remarks earlier this afternoon, was talking about your comments here on human rights, and he said, "I did not have a lot of admiration for that part of the trip." When you met with the General Secretary privately, we know, of course, that you discussed human rights. Did he say anything to you specifically about the meeting with dissidents or your remarks at Danilov Monastery or the remarks yesterday at the Writers' Union?
No, but I do know that he and others have had a feeling that in some way our concern with this is interfering with your internal government policies. I have explained to him, and I think maybe he has seen the point. Our country is very unique. All of us, either by ourselves or through our ancestors or our grandparents or parents, came from someplace else. We're about the only nation in the world that can say that. As a matter of fact, the estimate is that 1 out of 8 Americans trace their parentage and their heritage, if not their own emigration, to the Eastern Bloc. And so I have put it this way, that you don't stop loving your mother because you've taken unto yourself a wife. So the people in America do have a feeling for the countries of their heritage. In my case, it was a great-grandfather on one side and a grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side. Well, Americans retain that feeling of friendship and loyalty to the countries that, as I say, are their heritage. And so when we feel that people are being unjustly treated, imprisoned for something that in our country would not be a crime, calling for such a sentence, our people get aroused and they come to us and they want help. They want something done. A wife who's been waiting for 8 years for her husband to be allowed to leave this country to join her. Things of this kind we don't think are really interfering with someone else's business. We think it's very much our business to bring it to the attention where we feel that there is an injustice to the government. And I have explained this to the General Secretary, and I think he has seen the justice of what I've said, because many of the individuals that we've brought to his attention have now been released from confinement here and have been allowed to emigrate, come to other countries, to our country.
Mr. President, Mr. Gorbachev says that he proposed a draft statement and that would use the words peaceful coexistence. And he said that your first response to that was, "I like it," but that when you came back from meeting with your aides, you seemed to have changed your mind. Did you, and why?
Well, I liked the whole tone, the general tone of it, and what it was seeking to achieve was what we were both seeking to achieve. But I said at the same time I would take it to our people, and I took it there, and they studied it and saw where there could have been certain ambiguities in there that would not achieve the general thought of what was being proposed. We were in agreement with the general thought. So some rewriting was done by our own people. And when the total statement is released to you, I think you will find that we have achieved what it was he had with the paragraph that he proposed. And it's been achieved and improved to the point that it is clear and unmistakable that it achieves the purpose that he had in mind.
Officer, you sort of teased this now. Could you give us some sense of what you propose to substitute for peaceful coexistence? What's the better term that your aides have advised you to use?
No, peaceful coexistence, the same, both pieces achieve the same end, but the other one had ambiguities in it, and I don't think they were intentional, but they could have been used to justify doing something else that was not in keeping with the entire goal of the statement here. The young lady.
Mr. President, if I could follow up on your comments on immigration. Yesterday, when you were talking about a family denied the right to immigrate, you said that you called it a bureaucratic problem. You said you blamed the bureaucracy. Do you believe that essentially it is just bureaucratic lethargy that has caused that problem in the Soviet Union?
Well, now, somebody distracted me back there. I think someone else thought I had pointed at them instead of you.
Yesterday, when you spoke to the students about, you were talking about immigration and a family in particular that had been denied a right to immigrate, and you said you blamed the bureaucracy. Do you view the immigration problem from the Soviet Union as essentially a problem of just a lethargic bureaucracy?
I'm afraid that I have to confess to you that I think one of the sins of government, and one with which we must deal and never have been able to be completely successful with, and this includes our own government, is that the bureaucracy once created has one fundamental rule above all others: preserve the bureaucracy. And I think that governments will always find that they are having to check on bureaucracy and make sure that it is not abiding by its own rules and taking the easiest course. And so I wouldn't picking on one government other than another.
To follow up, you said that you believe you persuaded Mr. Gorbachev on some of these immigration questions, but he said on human rights in the United States that he did not find your arguments convincing. Do you consider that a failure in this summit?
I think that there is a mistaken view, and oh, how I yearn to have him come to our country for long enough to see some of our country. I think there's a mistaken view about the things that occasionally dominate the press, about prejudice, racial or religious, in our country, about people, the so-called street people that apparently have no place to live. And I think these problems, these are socio-economic problems in our land. We have them, of course. We also try to deal with them. But I don't think he quite could understand a recent situation. A young lady living on the sidewalks of New York, living out there on the sidewalk, winter and summer. And so for her own sake, the police picked her up to bring her to where she could be placed in a shelter. And she took her case to court and won her case in court that she should be allowed to go back and sleep on the sidewalk where she had been because that's what she preferred to do. Well, when you have a free country, how far can we go in impinging on the freedom of someone who says this is the way I want to live? And I think we could straighten him out if he saw what we did in our country. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, in this room on Monday, you heard moving stories of people who had been imprisoned, dissidents, religious people, and then you went to Moscow State University and you wrote it off to bureaucracy. Is that really your view, that it is only the bureaucracy, it is not a willful policy of the government here to keep these people from immigrating?
No. I can't say that it's one. I don't know that much about the system, but a question was presented to me on the basis that it possibly was a bureaucratic bungle. Maybe I should illustrate to you why I feel the way I do about bureaucracies. Once during the war, I happened to be involved in a situation in which one level of the military wanted a warehouse full of filing cabinets, wanted permission to destroy the files so they could use those filing cases, and they were able to prove that the documents had no historic value, they had no bearing on present-day government at all, they were just useless. And so the message went up through the ranks, requesting permission to destroy these obsolete files. And then back down through the ranks from the top command, endorsed by each level of command, came the reply permission granted, providing copies were made of each file destroyed.
Don't you think you're letting Mr. Gorbachev off a little easy on just saying it's bureaucracy?
No, as I said, I don't, the way the question was framed, I thought that there was a possibility of that. No, but I just have to believe that in any government, some of us do find ourselves bound in by bureaucracy, and then sometimes you have to stomp your foot and say unmistakably, I want it done, and then maybe you get through with it. But I have great confidence in his ability to do that.
Luke. Thank you, sir. You said, starting at the beginning of this year and going into this summit, that if there was this progress toward a START treaty, you would come together, be willing to come together a fifth time and sign it, but only if it was a good treaty. You've said today, you've referred to that today again several times. What is your judgment, your best judgment on the basis of this summit as to, have you made enough progress that you now think that a START treaty is likely within your term?
Lou, I honestly cannot answer that. I don't know. Let me just give you what the mechanics are, that our people have been steadily in Geneva, on both sides, Soviet people and our people, working on this treaty, knowing what we hope to achieve, and they're working there, and as I say, they've made progress. There is no way to judge, and there is no way that I would give them a date and say, please, you have to get this by such and such a time, because that's not the way to get a good treaty. I want a good treaty.
Sir, if I could follow up, is the only condition under which you would have a fifth summit with Mr. Gorbachev is if there was, in fact, what you thought was a good START treaty ready to be signed?
Well, you can't rule out something else might come up that necessitates our getting together and settling something other than that particular treaty. So no one can say, no, there will be no need for a summit. And when Helen says that, I'm sorry, I have to leave.
Mr. President, what have you learned about the Soviet Union? What have you learned in your first trip to Moscow?
I'm going to do one answer because I've wanted to say this, and I say it every time I get a chance. I think that one of the most wonderful forces for stability and good that I have seen in the Soviet Union are the Russian women.
The President of the United States, live from Spaso House, the residence of the U.S. Ambassador here in Moscow, with a news conference that is supposed to be the cap on this summit. In the news conference, Mr. Reagan said, quote, important work has been accomplished at this summit, especially, he said, quote, additional strides toward a strategic arms treaty. However, he emphasized that he would set no deadline for the actual agreement of such a treaty. What he suggested was some progress had been made toward a framework, but that a treaty itself was still some time away. Mr. Reagan said he was encouraged by signs of progress on human rights inside the Soviet Union, and he said he was deeply moved by what he saw as the spiritual values of the people. With me here, our State Department correspondent, former Moscow Bureau Chief Wyatt Andrews. Wyatt, has there been concern with the party traveling with President Reagan that he's had these periods in which he seems to nod off? Now, we didn't see any at the news conference today, but earlier this morning he had what was described as a fade period.
Well, Dan, you could see it. I mean, visibly, President Reagan was short on his answers this morning. He appeared tired. Marlon Fitzwater said yesterday that he didn't get a good night's sleep. Contrast that, though, with the press conference that he just gave, in which his answers seemed to be very responsive, and he seemed clear, especially at the last comment about women, at getting that one little sticking point that he's wanted to give all week, and he put it across again. So contrast the two. But there have been times when he has faded.
And Bill Plant, our White House correspondent, is standing by, having attended the news conference. Bill, from your experience, most important point of this news conference?
Dan, I think the most important point here was the tone that the president set, and I believe that that's what he set out to do. He didn't make much news in the sense that we usually judge it. He didn't tell us anything new that really about the START agreement, about new nuclear arms agreements, but he said over and over again that he found the people here warm and friendly, that he was able to get along with Mr. Gorbachev, that things were really more open. and he declined an opportunity several times to score the Russians for their treatment of their dissidents, particularly in the last couple of questions where he was asked if this could really be the bureaucracy. And he stuck to his answer that he'd found plenty wrong with bureaucracy. So I think the tone that he was trying to set is deliberate, and that's what he wants to leave as his impression here.
Thank you, Bill. CBS News will, of course, continue our summit coverage on CBS this morning, and Charles Garalt and I will bring you the full story of the day from inside the Kremlin on the CBS Evening News. Until then, Dan Rather, see you later.
This special report was part of CBS News' continuing coverage of the Moscow summit.
Statement Mr. Gorbachev made about this summit in his press conference. Gorbachev said, here we are ready to do business on arms control, a START treaty, and the president's SDI program is getting in the way. The human rights issue came up. Instead of being accommodating like Mr. Reagan was and blaming it on the bureaucracy, Mr. Gorbachev took some real shots at the president, saying he was trying to score propaganda points. Peter?
Well, thanks very much. And just before we go, I actually want to quote Bob Legvold, who's been so immensely helpful here, and made the point that as this summit has gone on, the Soviets have become to understand more clearly the American attitude towards human rights. And the president says that personal relationships and hopes for peace are not enough, but the differences between us continue. We're aware, he said, of change in this country. Therefore, my desire has not been to conduct a tutorial, which in fact he's done on a couple of occasions, at least from the Russian point of view.
At least they feel he has. Right. Peter Jennings, Bob Legvold, thank you very much. We have missed some commercials during the progress of the President's news conference at Spaso House. We are going to take a break for station identification, and then we will resume with more of Good Morning America.
In the opening night audience was Raisa Gorbachev, wife of the Communist Party leader. During the intermission, she told Mitchell he had a very special company and she felt lucky to see them perform. She returned to see them a second time. Now, just yesterday, Arthur Mitchell flew back to Moscow from Tbilisi, where his group has just ended a week-long run. Last night, he attended the dinner President Reagan gave for Secretary Gorbachev at Spaso House, and following this, you're off to Leningrad?
Yes.
Where are you going to be what?
We have to cure off. We'll be there for 12 performances.
You and Mrs. Gorbachev seem to become pretty fast friends, yes?
Well, she's an avid ballerina, and I fortunately had the pleasure of meeting her last year at the summit in Washington, D.C. with Secretary Schultz, and we started talking about the arts, and particularly dance, and that's what she told me about Nina Ananishvili, the young ballerina at the Bolshoi, who's Georgian, and I should go see her at Swan Lake, which I did do when I was here. And we just started talking about the arts, and we got to be very good friends.
You talked for about 20 minutes, didn't you?
25 minutes. As a matter of fact, we got so engrossed in the conversation, she said, you know, Mitchell, we must go now, otherwise we'll miss Othello.
Let's talk about what your performance. Dancing a Russian classic on home turf is kind of risky, isn't it?
Well, the thing is, I was fortunate to have a very close relationship with Mr. Balanchine and Mr. Stravinsky. And initially, I wasn't going to bring Firebird here, but then when we danced in Washington, the cultural attaché said, you must take this because we want the people to see how you've taken something that is very traditionally theirs and give it another dimension.
How'd it go over?
Fantastic. Everyone fell in love with Stephanie Dabney, the Firebird.
Can the same be said for the modern things that you've been doing?
Well, you know, it's interesting. At first, there was like a stunned silence. And then at the end, it was like, my God, we know we're seeing something we've never seen
different.
before.
I can roll in some tape of that performance, and I mean, as people who've been to the ballet can tell, it's a little bit different.
Yes, but it's been accepted. I mean, the students have been there, the teachers have been there, choreographers, because it's like eye-opening. It's getting a new taste and developing a new taste. And the enthusiasm has been incredible. Over 6,000 people a night.
Is that right? Has the enthusiasm differed from city to city, from Moscow to Leningrad to Tbilisi,
I would say in Tbilisi, they're a little more emotional about what they feel there. And since Balanchine was Georgian, it's another reason why there was a great sort of love coming across. But the arts are such an integral part of the lives here, and the people have a very paternal feeling about artists. And once they're open their heart to you,
then they're fine.
That's it.
You speak as a veteran on this because, I mean, let me, and I'm not I'm not trying to date you, but you came here 20 years ago.
25.
Excuse me. See, I try to help. 25 years ago and danced, and they loved you. What are the major changes you've seen now?
Well, the thing
I know they're enormous.
Yes, it's incredible. The changes in terms of the openness. They're willing to really want to see what's going on the outside. And again, that people have this avid interest in terms of what's happening in America. There's a great love for jazz. And the Gershwin piece has just been unbelievable. People were singing along with, shall we say. And it was like realizing there is a new vocabulary, and that's why I say dance theater we are American classicists dancing neoclassic style.
Well put. You have brought, what, 75?
There are 80 people altogether,
80 people.
60 dancers.
And for most of them, this is their first trip to the Soviet Union.
Yes, for the
What have
young
they
people.
thought?
Well, it's been mind-boggling. Can you imagine when you are walking in the Kremlin Palace, or you're in Tbilisi, or when we go to the Leningrad, and I said, Pavlova danced here, Nijinsky danced here. This is that tie with history that gives you that wonderful sense of I am, and that excitement of being an artist.
Yeah, it's still there, isn't it?
Oh, yes, and I'm the child, really. I'm still like, hey, look at that, look at this.
Have you had anybody come up to you and says, hey, I saw you dance 25 years ago, I saw you dance 30 years ago?
Are you kidding? It's like, when they come and say, you know, Mitchell, I was a little child. I said, get out of here. In fact, as a matter of fact, someone actually had a program that I had signed 25 years ago, and they brought the same program, and I signed it again and dated it 5/30/88.
I love it. Arthur, you're a wonderful ambassador for us.
Well, thank you very much.
Take care of yourself.
And thank you for having us on.
Always a pleasure. You
Take
know
care.
that. We're going to come back in just a moment. There's more ahead right after a station break.
Brubeck is no stranger to the Soviet Union. He's toured all around this country. His concerts have been broadcast on Soviet television, and Dave Brubeck joins us this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, what did you think?
I thought it was great. And I'll tell you, I was very nervous until the first tune.
Oh, stop.
I was, because this is like the power of the world sitting there. And you know they've had an exhausting day and a big dinner, and you're supposed to go out here for 15 minutes and make everything happy. And it's a nervous situation, but I could tell right in the first number that it was going to go great, and it did.
Well, I'm sure you were familiar with Van Cliburn treating the audience with Moscow Nights and Gorbachev standing up. Why did he take so to your jazz, do you think?
Well, someone said that they asked him if he liked jazz, and he said, I like good jazz, and this is good jazz.
They have a good ear. Do you think the Soviets are very familiar with American jazz?
Oh, they're so familiar with my music and jazz in general. We played right here in this hotel 5 nights in a row in a big auditorium, 3,000 seats, I think, was always full. All the tickets were sold in one afternoon, but the people knew every tune almost from the introduction. Now, this is hard to explain because they were only one album. I've made over 100 albums. One was for sale here, but they managed to get them in various ways, and they knew these tunes just from the introduction.
Are they better audiences than in the United States? Not quite as spoiled?
Well, that might be it. When you can't have something, that's the thing you want usually the most. And they were allowed to listen to the Voice of America sometimes. A lot of years it was jammed, so it didn't come in. And then other years, politically, situations would relax, and then the Voice of America could come in, and they played a lot of jazz on the Voice of America.
What was everyone talking about during dinner last night? Were they talking politics, arms, START agreement, or were they gossiping?
At our table, we were singing American pop tunes for some reason, and we could hear the strings that usually entertain at all the state functions were back kind of behind a curtain. And whenever the American songs would start, the woman next to me and the man next to me would mouth, and they knew the words in English, and very familiar with our popular music, our show music.
So it was a music talk last night.
Well, I couldn't speak Russian, they couldn't speak English too well. They were better than I, but the music, when it would come through, seemed like a natural thing for us to discuss.
Did you ever think that somehow you'd be a goodwill ambassador through your music?
Well, I've been traveling. In 1958, we went to 18 countries for the USIS, and I knew immediately that this was the answer to a lot of good feeling, cultural exchange. And we went to Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Poland, East and West Pakistan, India, Ceylon, just to name a few countries. And you get to know the artists are drawn, artists come, especially musicians, come to exchange ideas. And we played with many Indian musicians. Later on, Indian music came in through Ravi Shankar into our music, and there was a great exchange. But I think we were the first ones in India to have this exchange going.
The melding. Thank you, Dave Brubeck.
Thank you, Kathleen.
And we'll be back right after this.
We're going to have with us Abe Stolar, a man who has lived, an American actually, who has lived in the Soviet Union since 1931. He has been trying to leave since 1975. Mr. Reagan has made a great deal of Mr. Stolar's case while the president has been here, and we will talk to Mr. Stolar in this half hour. Also with us, Boris Yeltsin, an ousted Politburo member who feels that the Gorbachev reforms ought to go further and ought to go faster. Joan?
Well, good morning, Charlie. Good morning, everyone. I'm Joan Lennon. In this half hour, we are also going to meet two other Americans who made an unusual decision. They have decided to live in the Soviet Union, one in Moscow and one in Siberia. Hattie Kaufman visits them in their Soviet hometowns and found out why they chose to leave their native America. Now we'll go back to Charlie.
All right, Joan, with us here in Moscow, Peter Jennings, who has the news on the summit. Peter, good morning.
Okay, Charlie, good morning to you again. As you know, this has been the last sort of formal day for the President and Mr. Gorbachev. They've had that fourth meeting that you referred to. The President's going to go to the ballet tonight. They have both held news conferences, and it is about 5 o'clock in the afternoon here in Moscow, and just a short while ago, the President concluded his news conference. Here's an excerpt from some of what he said.
I think history will note
colder in the wintertime.
Yeah, I bet. It's Siberia.
Yes.
Scotty Skolchini will travel to the ends of the earth for love. When Scotty married his Soviet bride, the government informed the couple they would have to live in the village where she was born, Irkutsk, eastern Siberia.
Everyone, especially my family, and my friends also, they thought that I was going into voluntary exile.
He and Lita have been married for 7 years now. They live in this typically Siberian house with no indoor plumbing. Scotty wants to change that.
This is the front of the house right here.
He wants to build the kind of house you might find in any American suburb. 4 bedrooms, den, indoor bathrooms. Your basic Western ranch house. What things have frustrated you?
The system. If you make a request to someone, before you get an answer, first you have to go one office to get an application, another office to get it signed, a third office to get it okayed, then you mail it to another office, and you wait a month before you get an answer, and it goes on and on and on.
Not only does he want to build an American house in Siberia, he wants to fly the American flag right up there next to the scarlet banner of the Soviet Union.
And I've been trying to get permission for about 6 years, to no avail. It would represent a friendship between the two countries. You don't see any American and Soviet flags flying together here.
Scotty in Siberia, Paula in Moscow. They are Americans reducing the relationship between the superpowers to its most personal level.
All right, Charlie, you get a very positive feeling from both of these people and not a feeling of a lot of oppression. You've been there now for almost a week. What's it like as an American walking around? Is there a feeling of oppression?
No, you don't sense that, and it's very difficult in this cocoon of reporters that exists here covering the summit to really get a very good sense of what the situation is outside of Moscow, or indeed even around the city. You know, you don't have enough exposure to people here really to be able to tell.
Well, when we were in Sweden, we heard that, you know, you get all these services for free. However, they were complaining that the services weren't good. Has there been any indication as to what the services are like there in the Soviet Union? The medical care, the education?
Well, I can tell you what the hotel is like, but I don't think I will. You can leave it to your imagination. It is not Western style, what you'd expect here when you come. It's certainly a Westerner finds it very different, and that has certainly been the case here.
And you can wait for a long time for needed surgery and things, which we found out in Sweden.
Yeah, I suppose. I really don't know what the situation is within the medical service very well.
All right, well, Charlie, thank you. It looks like at least you got a nice day over there in the Soviet Union. And we'll be back in just a moment. Next half hour, Tom Hanks will be with us.
Swimming pool. And when I say year-round, that means that people are swimming in it during the winter, even when the temperatures get down to around 25 below. And the guidebooks say the January temperatures average between 12 above and 25 below. But still, people in this city go swimming. Steve Fox is right down at the pool now. It's much warmer there now, of course, but Steve Fox is there. Steve?
Hello, Charlie. I am told that this is the biggest swimming pool in the world. Not just the biggest swimming pool in Russia, the biggest pool in the world. You know, it seems that there's something about the Russian psyche that compels them to do things on a mammoth scale. Maybe it has something to do with the size of the country itself. Here's what I mean. Before this swimming pool was here, this site was the location of a gigantic church. It was called the Cathedral of Christ the Redeemer, and it was so big that as many as 10,000 worshipers could fit into the church at one time. Then, in the mid-30s or so, the Russian government blew up the church, demolished it, because they wanted to clear the site so they could build a huge building that they were going to call the Palace of the Soviets. It's going to be kind of government center. It was supposed to be taller than the Empire State Building, topped by a statue of Lenin more than 100 yards high. Now, World War II prevented that from happening, so in the 50s and early 60s, they built this swimming pool, which can accommodate as many as 20,000 people on a busy day. One of those people is likely to be this fella. Hello, George. Hello. This is George Merzin. George is a journalist who works for Radio Moscow. George swims here every other day of the year, 15 days a month, you say? I do. And his favorite time of the year to swim here, he tells me, is winter. Now, why winter?
So. It's fun to go swimming all the year round, and I was brought up in the south, you know, and we started as early as March there, swimming in lakes and rivers, and we finished as late as November. So living here when there's snow, ice, and winter, good Russian winter, very cold, and you swim just in the midst of it and no roof on you.
Tell me what that's like to come out here when it's, say, 25 below and get into the water.
No one comes out of the water. It's heated. It's about 28, 27 degrees centigrade, and it's good just down there.
Okay, in the middle of the summer when there's, say, 20,000 people using this in a day, what's it, wall-to-wall bodies? Is it real crowded?
I don't think it's just all the 25,000 people come here, because there are lakes and other swimming pools and rivers to swim in. Yeah. Less people come here in summertime than in winter.
Okay, thanks very much, George. Then have a nice swim today. Charlie, on a day like this when it's sunny, this is where the Russian people come to get sunburned, to get red, as it were. Charlie?
That's awful, Steve. That is awful.
Yes, it is.
But I certainly do understand his mention there that nobody comes out of it in the winter when it's that cold. If it's 75 in the pool and that cold out, I can understand why they stay in. We'll be right back. Tom Hanks with Joan London when we return.
There were actually two Russian revolutions in 1917. The first, in March, overthrew the Tsar and set up a republic. The second, in November, put the communists in power.
Dear John,
Looks and impressions. Last day of the summit, last night for us in Moscow's majestic Hall of Columns. And to talk about the substance of the summit, Barry Peterson, Bill Plant, and Wyatt Andrews. Barry, first, Gorbachev, an assessment of how it ended up for him.
I think, Dan, that Gorbachev got exactly what he wanted, a summit of style over substance, and he can paint himself looking like the young, aggressive winner. But I submit to you that paint is one layer deep. What he didn't get was any kind of a stop in the arms race, and without that, he's got to keep spending the money on weapons and not spend the money to fulfill the promise of a better life in this country.
Wyatt Andrews, what did we and did not get in terms of arms agreements?
Dan, in arms, from a very inside baseball, if you will, professional arms negotiator point of view, they made some impressive strides in the details on verifying mobile missiles and in the details of verifying air-launched cruise missiles. The big gap is what it's always been, though, Star Wars. Any sort of compromise on whether Star Wars should be tested, should it go in space, should it stay in the laboratory, it went nowhere. And it makes all this talk about, will there be a START treaty, will there be a fifth summit, take all of that with a grain of salt.
Bill Plant, does the president really believe, as he said, that it's the Soviet bureaucracy that keeps down people of Jewish heritage and other dissidents who refuse to accept?
Dan, a lot of people were stunned when the president refused 3 times to blame Gorbachev for the Soviet system for not letting people out of here and blame the bureaucracy instead. The only possible explanations are that he didn't want to offend his host, or that the word bureaucracy triggers in him an automatic response that goes back 20 years. In any case, there are a lot of people who feel that it borders on the absurd.
Wyatt, the reality of what was accomplished for human rights here?
Well, Dan, the human rights situation in the Soviet Union is improving, and it may be that, just maybe, that President Reagan avoided slamming Gorbachev today on human rights because of what's going on. A few of the refuseniks on the list that President Reagan presented to Gorbachev are getting out. We know acquaintances and friends who've gotten phone calls today saying, come by the visa office when the summit's over and you get your, you'll have your ticket out. Others, though, did not get that phone call today. And once again, Gorbachev just doesn't seem to sink in on him that this is the essential cruelty of it all. Gorbachev is still unapologetic about it and really doesn't seem to understand it. But that's what happened.
Well, Barry, that raises the question, what is the reality versus the perception of glasnost?
This summit is a terrific example of that, Dan, and our being here is a great example of that. We've had incredible access to the Soviet Union. Policemen have stopped traffic for us to take pictures instead of stopping us from taking pictures. But glasnost is still what it always was. It's not the Bill of Rights. It's not freedom of press or freedom of religion. Glasnost is the freedom to say what the party says you're supposed to say, and it hasn't changed.
Bill, what about this talk that Gorbachev, in effect, tried to roll President Reagan, tried to pick his pockets?
Absolutely. The White House people now think that Gorbachev tried to pull a fast one from day one. Gave the president a plain white piece of paper with some language on it that had words like peaceful coexistence. Says, how's it look? The president says, well, it looks pretty good. But then they took it back and studied it, and they said no. Today, the last day, pressed him again, said, why won't you sign this? And they went at it, as it was described to me, just hammer and tong for most of the session. And the president finally said, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to do it. And as somebody put it to me, you just have to tell them no a dozen times.
Gentlemen, thanks for dealing with the substance of today's summit story. Now, as we know, there's a social side of the summit. Charles Carrault will be up next with a report on that, and Bob Schieffer will be in New York with the day's other major news.
Loyalty to Stalin that Gorbachev is attempting to wipe out with television documentaries, films, and books critical of Stalin's brutal reorganization of the Soviet economy, his labor camps, the deaths of millions who stood in Stalin's way.
Stalin, he's not so dead. I think we really must fire at Stalin.
Or at what he left behind. A centrally controlled economy that is failing, inefficient heavy industry, and an agricultural system that can't feed the Soviet people. If Gorbachev has his way, 10 million workers will lose their jobs as he reorganizes the economy, mostly administrative jobs created by the Stalin system. It's not easy.
Think what would happen in Washington if Mr. Reagan says 50% of all civil servants, federal civil servants, are going to be dismissed and will have to find some other job or retire. It'd be a bombshell. Just wouldn't be tolerated.
Gorbachev is even attacking the system of privilege established by Stalin for the people at the top. Gorbachev is selling nearly half of the enormous number of cars the bureaucrats get with their jobs. Gorbachev is also closing down many special stores where selected Soviets get better food and clothing. That's bringing on anger and frustration in the final days of Special Advantage.
As Gorbachev tries to change the course that Stalin set for this complex and powerful nation, he is well aware of what happened the last time a Soviet leader took on Stalinism.
That was Nikita Khrushchev. He openly attacked Stalin and his policies, but when the economy under Khrushchev went into a steep slide, he was dumped from power. The old Stalinist ways were revived. Millions of Soviet citizens remember that time. Once again, they're caught in the middle, and they're understandably cautious about jumping on the Gorbachev bandwagon.
If they commit themselves and Gorbachev fails, and the rightist, the conservatives, come into power, they will all suffer. They will have to pay the price.
Joseph Stalin, a part of Russia's past, still an obstacle to its future.
There likely will be more attacks on Stalin later this month when the Soviets will have a general conference of the Communist Party. It's the first one since 1941. And it does promise to be one of the monumental events of the 70-year-old communist revolution here when Mikhail Gorbachev attempts to get broad approval for his reforms.
This hammer is twice as strong.
Shipboard ritual. Endless drill. Although the pinups are different, the quarters are just as cramped. For most sailors, even those who like the life, 3 years is enough.
I've enjoyed 2 years in the Navy, but at the end of next year, I'm going back to farming.
We were on board only a few hours, and Captain Orlov looked like he couldn't wait for us to leave. As soon as we were off, the ship weighed anchor and moved quickly out into the Black Sea, ending what for both sides had been a truly unique naval engagement. In future arms control agreements, Americans would have to be able to determine whether or not that ship is carrying nuclear weapons. And inspections much more rigorous than ours would have to become routine. David Martin, CBS News in the Black Sea.
And with me again tonight, my colleague and friend Charles Kuralt. Charlie, this was the big night on the social calendar for the Reagans and the Gorbachovs.
Yes, the highlight was a gala evening at the Bolshoi Ballet. Before the ballet, I'm afraid there was another of those little spats between Raisa Gorbachev and Nancy Reagan. Mrs. Reagan was late for a visit to a museum, and Mrs. Gorbachev, who was waiting for her, emphasized her tardiness to the press.
Particularly because you are here on time and the guests are late, so you have a chance to have a look around by yourself.
And when Mrs. Reagan finally got there and Mrs. Gorbachev was speaking, Mrs. Reagan interrupted.
I want to say something. I want to say something. Okay?
But the Bolshoi dancers have a way of erasing the cares of the day. Really, they are otherworldly, the most accomplished dancers of the world, and their dancing is a magnificent sight to see. However, the moment Americans who were there will remember always from this long day was the moment when the Bolshoi Orchestra of the Soviet Union played the Star-Spangled Banner as magnificently as it ever has been played, with the whole audience facing the box where the Reagans and Gorbachev stood. If you've never felt the thrill down your spine that comes from hearing your national anthem played in a foreign place, prepare to feel it now.
Number 2 man in the early years. Well, Trotsky was sick the day we took pictures. And nothing of Nikita Khrushchev, the former premier in the 60s. You know, I've been meaning to get around to putting him up. Mikhail Gorbachev's been urging historians to start examining these blank pages in Soviet history, and the historians say it's about time.
We have to make history a science and not merely a servant of politicians.
But it hasn't happened yet. Nikolai Bukharin, another of Lenin's good buddies, was in 1929, but he's been out since 1951. No, wait, he's back in again. There's Bukharin next to Stalin in the Lenin Museum. We just put Bukharin back up, says the curator, after Mr. Gorbachev spoke well of him the other day. Can Soviet historians expect they'll be permitted to tell it like it was from now on? There's a saying here. In the Soviet Union, the only thing that's more unpredictable than the future is the past. Richard Threlkeld, ABC News, Moscow.
Joining us again tonight, our Soviet analyst from the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, Robert Legfold. Bob, you have argued that this is an historic summit. What makes you think so?
Peter, sometimes history comes quietly, and this summit, so predictable and in many ways uneventful, has made quiet history. From now on, or at least for the next several years, American presidents and Soviet general secretaries, when they meet, are not likely to do so at grand ceremonial occasions marking the conclusion of major agreements, but in order to probe the other man's mind, and in order to learn by arguing, as these two men have been doing for the last week.
Do you think this is the way the Soviets want it?
I think they are definitely ready to do so.
Why do you think they are?
Because Gorbachev understands there has to be a real foundation if there's to be a change in U.S.-Soviet relations. It can't be done through superficial agreements.
So at the end of this summit, you are convinced that Mr. Gorbachev is prepared to make even more radical change in his approach to the U.S.?
Indeed. The issue is not just reform within the Soviet Union, but in Soviet foreign policy.
Bob Legfold, thanks very much. I'll have a final note from Moscow later in the broadcast, politics and art. And when we come back, Barry Serafin will have the rest of the day's news.
The religious character of the icons, and that got the attention of Nancy Reagan.
Well, I don't know how you can neglect the religious implications. I mean, they're there for anybody to see.
Mrs. Gorbachev was dominating the scene, and Nancy Reagan was annoyed.
Now, I want to say something. I want to say something. Okay? All right.
The relationship between these two women was summed up by Mrs. Reagan's press secretary. She said, "These women are from totally different worlds."
John Chancellor is here with commentary now. And John, I suppose that a lot of people will be working hard to define this new era of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. After all, we've been living with the Cold War for a long time.
Well, I've been thinking about the Cold War, Tom, and I've been asking myself a question about it. Let me put it to you. Is the Cold War over? Did the West win it, but not realize it? Let's take a look at that idea. A lot of people have never known anything but the Cold War. Many Americans were growing up during the Berlin blockade, the Korean War, the Hungarian Revolution, the building of the Berlin Wall. There was plenty of evidence that Russia was the enemy. It held Eastern Europe in an iron grip. It threatened Western Europe. It was expansionist abroad and repressive at home. Stalin was a brutal dictator. Khrushchev was a dangerous buffoon. We reacted to all that, of course, as we should have. It cost a lot. The Russians made the military-industrial complex what it is today. But hold on. Today, Western Europe is safe and prosperous. Eastern Europe is changing. West Berlin is secure. Communist China is not a menace. Only a few third-world countries have gone communist in the last 40 years. The Soviet model for economic and political development is a joke around the world. The Soviet economy itself is a joke. And the winds of change are blowing across Moscow. Who dined at a dacha here tonight? Ronald Reagan. We've been fighting the Cold War for about 4 decades, and it's built into our thinking. But the reasons for fighting it have changed. Nobody's suggesting that we drop our guard as far as the Russians are concerned. They're still dangerous. But the Cold War, as we knew it and feared it, is over. In fact, we won it. Maybe we should have a parade, which is commentary for tonight. Tom?
Thanks, John. And there have been lots of changes within the Soviet Union as well. In a moment, a look at how those changes and how the press has been able to operate in the Soviet Union since the last time an American president visited this country 14 years ago.
Oh, look at me back in the 60s, working up a sweat. Oh,
Right here on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. If perestroika is going to mean more work for Yuri Gushin, he wants none of it. He doesn't do much on the train, and he's well paid for not doing it. He likes things fine the way they are. Zhenya Rashidulov could serve as a model for the more vigorous Russia Gorbachev is trying to build. He's a go-getter. He moves fast. When we tried to talk to him, he said, "Sorry, I can't stop now. As you guys say, time is money. Would you folks like to buy some goulash?" Other people on the train talk about perestroika, some of them very frankly. During Brezhnev's era, it was terrible, he says. People didn't work, and there was much corruption. Gorbachev has given the country some discipline. There's more independence and self-reliance. This man isn't so sure about perestroika. We're just not ready for it, he says. It's a good idea, I suppose, but as far as I can see, the only change is that the price of vodka has gone up. She is for perestroika. In my town, she says, I live in a barracks. We have no plumbing, no toilet facilities. To clean ourselves, we go to the bathhouse. For water, we go to the well. But already we're feeling the effects of perestroika. They're building 5-story houses now. They're rebuilding the whole town. Other people on the train talk about the old and the new of the Soviet Union. But in Yuri, the thumb-twiddling waiter, and Genya, the hustling goulash salesman, you can actually see it. Yuri says, I like this job because I get to wear a bow tie. All the food workers on the train work under a common plan, he says. The more Genya works, the less I have to work. He's so good, he feeds the whole train. Look around here, the dining car's half empty. It's okay with me. Genya says, I work a month and have 2 weeks off. If I exceed the dining car plan, I get a bonus. It's a profit for me and for the state. I can make 300 rubles a month, he says. That's more than a doctor. Then I have a dacha with a garden, and I'm kind of a part-time farmer on the side. Whatever my family doesn't eat, I sell. I sell a lot, he says. The Soviet Union was created to be the workers' paradise, but it turns out a lot of them just don't work much. Gorbachev would like to put all the Yuris to work for a change. What Gorbachev needs is about 100 million Genyas. Yuri says, if you use your head, you can make a little extra money at this job. You know what I mean? Don't things like that happen in America, too? Kidding Genya, we said, what do you charge for that stuff? Do you give it away for free? Oh, no, he said. I can't afford communism.
And that's tonight's CBS Evening News. With Charles Carroll, Dan Rather. Charles will be here in Moscow tomorrow. I'll be reporting from London, President Reagan's next stop. See you then. Good night.
Don't be late.
We're finally hearing the truth, she said, about the Stalin period. And who are the opponents of Mr. Gorbachev's reforms? There's one poster attack after the other on the bureaucrats. If you're going to use the army for something constructive, it says, let them carry out the bureaucrats. And while you're at it, send those in the army who are corrupt to the cleaners. And finally this, the blank front page of the Communist Party newspaper Pravda, which is Russian for truth. Maybe the presence of the pencil suggests that in the future people will be freer to write their own truth. And that is our report on World News tonight. Tomorrow morning we'll be in London when the President arrives there at around 6:30 Eastern Time. Until tomorrow, I'm Peter Jennings. Good night from Moscow.
Is professor of Soviet politics and history at Princeton University and author of the book Rethinking the Soviet Experience. Richard Pearl is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration, now a contributing editor for U.S. News and World Report. Gentlemen, Mr. Gorbachev said today the era of disarmament has begun, and he said each of these summit meetings has dealt a blow at the foundations of the Cold War. Has the Cold War ended?
It hasn't ended, and 40 years of Cold War isn't going to end with 3 years of glossiness and symmetry. People are divided about the Cold War. I think we've got to end it. The arms race, which is part of the Cold War, has made it too dangerous to survive with. But it's a long march to the end of the Cold War. This is a beginning, but it's going to take a long time, a lot more political leadership before we can say that the Cold War, and particularly the arms race, which is its centerpiece, have come to an end.
Do you agree with General Secretary Gorbachev's formulation that these summit meetings are chipping away at the foundations of the Cold War?
I'm not at all sure that's the case. It's certainly not the case that the weapons are themselves the source of the tensions that we describe by the term Cold War. It's rather the other way around, that the political differences have led us certainly to believe that we need weapons in order to protect our security and that of our allies.
On the achievements of this summit, Richard Pearl, the no framework agreement, something that had been widely talked about, appeared from the summit. And the opening paragraph of the communique issued speaks of serious disagreements on a number of important issues. What does that tell you, with all your experience of these things, about how much progress they have actually made on the START agreement?
I believe they made rather more progress than that part of the communique may suggest. I'm not at all unhappy that there was no framework agreement. It was American policy not to have a framework agreement, although there were some internal divisions over that, and for a very good reason. Framework agreements, broad agreements that lay down general principles but fail to specify the critical details, create pressures to conclude rapid agreements thereafter. And we tend to lose out in the detailed negotiations, which are really the essence of what these treaties entail.
Don't they, in effect, have a framework agreement on the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty coming from their last meeting last December?
Well, indeed, and when you look at the communique, it rather summarizes what has already been agreed, certainly the numbers that have been agreed to, and one could say that that constitutes a sort of framework agreement. But what it falls short of doing is creating such momentum toward the conclusion of a treaty that we are forced to abandon critical points of detail in order to rush and wrap something up.
Does that have a significance for you, no framework agreement?
The only significance for me is, as I said last night, the faster the better. I mean, the arms race is proceeding at such a tremendous speed. There are only two things that can stop it. One is a complete ban on the testing of nuclear weapons and the delivery systems, just to give the politicians time to figure out a way to stop building weapons and to throw away 50% or more of what we have.
I asked Howard Baker whether, following on what Senator Dole and Senator Byrd said today, that it would be impossible for the Senate to ratify that treaty if President Reagan were to sign one before he left office. There just wouldn't be time, it being so much more complicated than the INF treaty. And I asked Baker whether that was a reason for the president not signing such a treaty. Do you think it should be that he wouldn't be around to preside over the ratification process?
I think his spirit would certainly preside over the ratification process, and I can't imagine the Senate of the United States not ratifying a Ronald Reagan treaty that reduced strategic forces by approximately half. But can I say to Steve, Steve, relax. The arms race you're talking about is more mythology than real. The United States has fewer nuclear weapons today than we had on the day Ronald Reagan took office, and this notion that there is some frantic increase is simply wrong.
50,000 warheads in the world, nuclear warheads. We've rigged the globe with nuclear weapons. It's too many. Everybody knows that.
What about the phrase peaceful coexistence that the U.S. side, Mr. Gorbachev made a point of this today, Mr. Reagan was asked about it, we've heard what Howard Baker had to say. Why is peaceful coexistence such a loaded term, and why should the American side shy away from it? Just for domestic political reasons?
I suppose that's the reason. I think it originated in modern times with Khrushchev. Though you can trace it back to Lenin. It got a bad odor, therefore. It's become rather like the word détente in the United States. We have a new détente, but we're not allowed to call it a new détente because the politicians feel uneasy with the word. The real process that's underway, I mean, the phenomenon we're talking about, this process between Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev, is an attempt to end a 40-year Cold War, whose centerpiece is building weapons.
But doesn't the phrase... Excuse me, doesn't the two words, peaceful coexistence, precisely describe the state of affairs between the two countries now? They have agreed to coexist and to coexist peacefully. They underlined again, no more war.
But Robert, what was at issue here was not just the phrase peaceful coexistence, but a whole paragraph of standard Soviet boilerplate that we used to accept routinely in communiques. In the early 70s, you'll find this language in all of the communiques that were signed. This administration made the decision, and it was made in Geneva, and it was made in an all-night negotiating session in which I participated, that we would stop speaking with a Russian voice in these communiques. We would stop standing up and repeating translations from the Russian language that consisted of their long-term propaganda goals. And that, pure and simple, is the reason why we've not been prepared to accept it.
What do you make of Mr. Reagan several times in Moscow, two at least that I can identify, at the Moscow University and again today in his press conference, saying it's Soviet bureaucrats, the bureaucracy, who mistreat political dissidents by sending them to jail or internal exile or psychiatric hospitals?
I think you have to see it in the context of something rather touching and both significant that occurred between the two men while they were here. When they walked around and were together, Mr. Gorbachev rather carried Mr. Reagan. He knew Mr. Reagan was tired. He tried to answer the questions, make it easy on him, much as President Carter carried President Brezhnev, an older man in the late 70s. On the other hand, today, President Reagan went out of his way at his press conference to defend Mr. Gorbachev against what was a kind of attack by the American media. The American media was almost baiting the American president. Wasn't he trusting Mr. Gorbachev too much? Wasn't he misreading the nature of abuse of power and the mistreatment of dissidents in this country? And Mr. Reagan rose to the defense of Mr. Gorbachev. It was quite extraordinary.
Did you see it that way?
I think the president is in fact defending Gorbachev. I think he's made a decision that the Gorbachev reforms are reforms that in the long term are in the American interest if they can succeed. And I think he was partly right about the bureaucracy. He just neglected to mention that the bureaucracy takes its orders from the political leadership. And so, in fact, Gorbachev has to bear responsibility.
Mr. Baker's just told us that Mr. Reagan does not believe or is not by any means certain that the Gorbachev reforms are going to be something that he can count on down the line. I quoted him your line from the other night about it being dangerous to negotiate with a huge nation in a state of such political turmoil, and he thinks it is dangerous to do so. Does that give you comfort?
It does indeed.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
It worries me because he misses the main point. A tremendous political struggle is underway here. But the United States has to decide if it wants to see Mr. Gorbachev prevail at home. I believe it's in America's national interest that he do so.
Haven't you, in effect, suggested a moment ago that that is what Mr. Reagan has decided? That,
well, I think Mr. Reagan has decided it, but men such as Mr. Pearl aren't so certain. Mr. Baker doesn't seem to be so certain. I mean, Cold War attitudes still dominate American thinking about Russia. How far we've come, however, is symbolized in some ways by Mr. Pearl's willingness here in Moscow occasionally to concede that Gorbachev is a real thing.
Look, it isn't a question of whether one does or one does not negotiate. It's a question of the kinds of risks one is prepared to run in the agreements that are reached. And you don't, it seems to me, irreversibly diminish your military security on the assumption that you're facing a more benign Soviet leadership, because that could change.
We're back to the basic problem. You have a kind of ideology that you can never have too many weapons or too good of weapons. My point is, we have too many weapons. It's too dangerous to continue like this.
Let me state my view my way. I presided over a committee that removed 1,400 nuclear weapons from our arsenal, Steve. We want the right number of weapons, and the right number is the number that will bring some stability to this relationship.
Let me ask each of you in a word. Do you go away from Moscow encouraged by what's happened here? Richard Pearl?
Well, I'm encouraged if Gorbachev is successful. I think it's a very difficult task because the changes he has in mind are so fundamental.
Stephen Cohen?
I'm discouraged by what he said. It makes it seem it's all up to Gorbachev. We have to meet Gorbachev halfway. It takes two to tango.
Stephen Cohen, Richard Pearl, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Again, the summit was the major news of this day. Misters Reagan and Gorbachev wrapped up the official part of the meeting with good words about each other and about the future of the U.S.-Soviet relationship. Mr. Reagan leaves Moscow tomorrow for a stopover visit in London before returning to the United States Friday. We'll see you tomorrow night. I'm Jim Lehrer. Thank you and good night.
Funding for the MacNeil Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T, combining everything